America's history is packed with glory and grit, but buried between the wars and speeches are the stories too dumb to make the textbooks. Rogue vice presidents, exploding bats, Congress evicted by a bar tab. These aren't conspiracy theories. They happened. And they're so absurd, you'll question reality, sanity, and maybe the entire concept of government. So buckle up for a 2-hour dive into 49 moments from U.S. history so bafflingly real. They feel fake. Welcome to the side of America they hope you never ask about. 1. Congress once met in a tavern because they got kicked out of Philadelphia by a mutiny of unpaid soldiers, 1783. For a nation supposedly founded on Enlightenment ideals and noble revolution, the early days of American governance played out more like a rejected Monty Python sketch. Picture it, the Continental Congress, those powdered wig philosophers, landowners, and legal minds, huddled together in a tavern in Princeton, New Jersey. Not because they were slumming it for fun, but because they had literally been chased out of Philadelphia by a pack of angry, unpaid soldiers with muskets and bills to settle. It was June 1783. The Revolutionary War was technically over, and Congress was lounging in the Pennsylvania State House trying to figure out how to fund a country with no money and no real centralized power. Meanwhile, several hundred Continental Army soldiers were outside demanding the salaries they'd been promised for years. When the soldiers realized the government's answer was, "We'll get back to you," they did what any reasonable group of war-hardened men would do. They mutinied. The mutiny wasn't violent in the traditional sense, no bloodshed, no barricades, but it was loud, angry, and armed. The soldiers blockaded the building and refused to let members of Congress leave until they were paid. Congress, being allergic to confrontation and perhaps even more allergic to fiscal responsibility, called on the Pennsylvania state government to send in the militia and protect them. Pennsylvania's leaders thought about it for a minute and said, essentially, yeah. No. So, Congress did the only logical thing. They ran. They slipped out of town, found refuge in a tavern in Princeton, and declared that they were still technically in session, just with more beer and significantly fewer expectations. This was the embryonic form of the U.S. federal government, forced to flee by its own unpaid troops, conducting the business of a fledgling nation from behind a bar. The incident led to a quiet but pivotal decision. Never again would Congress allow itself to be at the mercy of local uprisings. It planted the seed for establishing a distinct federal district later known as Washington, D.C., where Congress could deliberate in peace, surrounded by its own loyal security and far from angry mobs of disgruntled employees. Still, it's hard to unsee it. The birth of American power happening not in hallowed halls or grand marble chambers, but in the back room of a colonial pub, hiding from its own army. The symbolism is subtle but brutal. American governance, from the start, has been running on IOUs and improvisation. And yet somehow, in the middle of all this chaos, one man saw opportunity. His name was Aaron Burr, and his solution to America's post-war identity crisis was to fire a pistol into history and aim for something far stranger than Congress could ever imagine. 2. Aaron Burr killed Hamilton in a duel, and then tried to start his own empire in the West. Yes, really. You know the story, or at least the musical. Aaron Burr, disgruntled vice president, and Alexander Hamilton, the human Red Bull of the Founding Fathers, met at dawn in Weehawken, New Jersey. Words were exchanged, pistols were raised, and one of them walked away. Burr killed Hamilton, then fled like a gentleman outlaw, still vice president, mind you, wearing a waistcoat and casually evading murder charges. But that's just the opening act. Because Aaron Burr, never one to let a little thing like national scandal get in the way of a grand illusion, turned his post-duel exile into Act 2, the Empire Plan. Burr looked westward and thought, what if I just make my own country? And he almost did. Burr started recruiting ex-soldiers, charming, powerful landowners, and having very secretive meetings with anyone who hated Thomas Jefferson, which, in 1805, was a lot of people. He made vague promises to foreign governments, including Britain and Spain, dangling the idea of carving out a new empire from the chaos of the Louisiana Purchase. His target? A chunk of the American Southwest and possibly Mexico. What he planned to do once he had it remains unclear. Found a monarchy, crown himself Lord of the Cactus, who knows? The problem was, Burr was doing all of this while still technically holding public office. It was like if your company's CFO suddenly started a LinkedIn group called How to Take Over Texas Without Telling HR. Eventually, rumors of his wild ambitions got loud enough to reach President Jefferson himself, who decided to do something rare. Pay attention. Burr was arrested and put on trial for treason in 1807. The trial was a circus. There was no clear evidence. The witnesses were confused, and Burr, ever the lawyer, defended himself with eerie composure. He was acquitted, technically innocent, though also permanently radioactive. After that, Burr went full ghost mode. He fled to Europe, tried pitching his empire idea to Napoleon, who laughed him out of the room, and eventually returned to the U.S. under an alias. He died decades later, broke and mostly forgotten. What remains is a portrait of a man who not only broke the rules, but tore up the whole playbook and tried to write a sequel. And for a moment, just a sliver of American twilight, it almost worked. But if Burr's dream was to crown himself emperor, Alexander Hamilton once had his own idea for American royalty. A quieter plan. A slow-burn monarchy hidden under the phrase president for life. The U.S. almost chose a monarchy. Alexander Hamilton floated the idea of a president for life. Let's rewind a bit. Back before the pistols, before the egos collided. Back to when Alexander Hamilton was just a fast-talking immigrant with a genius brain and a plan that sounded, well, a little British. While the revolution was supposed to liberate America from monarchy, Hamilton couldn't quite shake the feeling that monarchies worked. At least they didn't fall apart because some tavern mutiny scared off the government. To Hamilton, democracy was risky business. It was messy, emotional, and most dangerous of all, it handed power to the masses. And Hamilton didn't really trust the masses. So when it came time to draft a new system of government under the proposed Constitution, Hamilton stood up and casually dropped a political nuke into the room. He proposed a president with sweeping executive power, unelected by the people, who would serve for life unless removed for wrongdoing. Think king, but with better branding. The room, to put it mildly, did not love it. Even in a gathering full of elitist landowners and Enlightenment philosophers, Hamilton's president for life sounded like heresy. It stunk of the very thing they'd just finished bleeding to escape. George Washington, the most obvious candidate for this role, rejected the idea outright. Others feared it would become a slippery slope. First a president for life, then a crown, then powdered wigs for everyone again. Hamilton, always 5 steps ahead and 3 rooms too loud, eventually backed off. But he never fully abandoned the dream of a strong, centralized, near-monarchical executive. His fingerprints are still there. In the Electoral College, in the centralized banking system, in the relentless tug-of-war between federal and state power. The irony? Hamilton died in a duel trying to stop the kind of power grabs he once flirted with, and Aaron Burr, who had no patience for philosophical debates, tried to actually do what Hamilton only theorized. In the end, America didn't get a king. It got something much weirder. A democracy that behaves like royalty whenever convenient, wrapped in rituals, dynasties, and ceremonial pageantry. The monarchy didn't vanish, it just got rebranded. And somewhere, in an alternate timeline not too far from our own, there's a bald eagle perched on a velvet throne, and Benjamin Franklin is scowling, because he really wanted that throne decorated with turkeys. For Ben Franklin wanted the turkey to be the national bird. There are few moments in American history more revealing than the one where Benjamin Franklin, printer, inventor, philosopher, and all-around professional troublemaker, looked at the freshly chosen national emblem of the United States, the bald eagle, and said essentially, "Absolutely not. That bird is a fraud." In Franklin's mind, the bald eagle was the political equivalent of a dishonest politician. It looked noble from a distance, but up close it was lazy, mean, and opportunistic. A bird of bad moral character, he wrote to his daughter, explaining that the eagle was a thief who stole food from smaller birds and avoided honest work. He had a point. Bald eagles, majestic as they appear, are notorious scavengers. They'll happily steal a fish from an osprey rather than catch one themselves. A winged metaphor for political corruption if there ever was one. The turkey, on the other hand, Franklin argued, was the true symbol of American virtue, a much more respectable bird, he wrote. It was brave, self-reliant, and native to the continent. The turkey didn't steal, didn't posture, and would actually defend its territory. It might not soar as gracefully as the eagle, but at least it earned its meals honestly. It was, in other words, the ideal citizen of Franklin's imaginary republic. Picture that alternate America for a moment. The presidential seal, engraved not with a fierce eagle clutching arrows, but with a round, slightly bewildered turkey puffing its feathers in patriotic determination. Military medals would feature plump birds in mid-strut. Thanksgiving would feel like a national day of moral confusion. Tourists at the National Mall would point reverently at bronze statues of gobblers. Somewhere, an artist in Philadelphia would be sketching the Great Seal of the United Gobbles of America. Of course, Franklin's turkey never stood a chance. The bald eagle had already been chosen by the Continental Congress in 1782, mostly for its majestic appearance and, let's be honest, its intimidating name. The turkey doesn't strike quite the same fear into the hearts of enemies. Franklin's protest was politely ignored, and his idea faded into the background, resurfacing only when Americans needed a quirky trivia fact to prove that their founding fathers were, indeed, eccentric beyond belief. Still, Franklin's bird debate wasn't just comic relief. It reflected a deeper tension running through the early republic, the battle between image and integrity. The eagle represented power, dominance, and spectacle, qualities that would come to define much of American politics. The turkey represented humility and grounded virtue, qualities that over time became harder to find. In that way, Franklin's suggestion was less about ornithology and more about philosophy. He saw the risk of a country choosing glory over honesty, symbols over substance. And, ironically, that's exactly what happened. The bald eagle became America's favorite metaphor, majestic, photogenic, and mostly interested in stealing someone else's fish. But Franklin wasn't done being weirdly prophetic, because while he was defending the moral character of poultry, one of his colleagues was imagining an America filled not with birds, but with mammoths. 5. Thomas Jefferson believed in a race of mammoths still roaming North America. He sent Lewis and Clark to find them. Thomas Jefferson, third President of the United States and self-proclaimed man of science, was the kind of Enlightenment thinker who believed that reason could explain everything, except, apparently, extinction. To Jefferson, the idea that a species could simply vanish from the earth was unthinkable. If God had created a creature as magnificent as the mammoth, why would he just delete it? No, Jefferson reasoned, the great beast must still be out there, somewhere. Probably in the uncharted wilderness of the American West. He wasn't joking. Jefferson was sure that mammoths, or what he called American elephants, still roamed beyond the Mississippi. He collected fossilized bones and teeth from dig sites in Kentucky and Virginia, studying them by candlelight in Monticello. He even filled the White House's entrance hall with a sort of prehistoric art installation, a massive collection of bones and tusks that made visiting diplomats wonder if the president was secretly running a natural history museum on the side. When Jefferson commissioned the Lewis and Clark expedition in 1804, his goals weren't purely political or geographic. Yes, he wanted to map the Louisiana Purchase. Yes, he wanted to find a navigable route to the Pacific. But he also wanted proof. Physical, undeniable proof that America was still home to giants. In private letters, he asked the explorers to keep an eye out for the mammoth and other unknown quadrupeds. Lewis and Clark, being professionals, politely entertained the idea. They cataloged hundreds of new species, plants, animals, insects, But no mammoths, no woolly herds, no towering beasts lumbering across the plains. What they found instead was something Jefferson hadn't expected: silence. The bones of ancient creatures buried deep beneath the surface of a continent that had long since moved on. Jefferson never gave up the dream. Even after the expedition returned, he continued to argue that extinction was an illusion. He believed the West was too vast, too mysterious to rule out entirely. Maybe the mammoths had simply migrated north, or hidden in some undiscovered valley. He was, in a way, America's first cryptozoologist, a scientist chasing myth under the banner of reason. The irony is rich. The same man who drafted the Declaration of Independence, arguably one of the most rational documents in political history, also believed that somewhere out there, elephants were hiding behind pine trees. And maybe, in a poetic sense, he was right. The spirit of the mammoth, the longing for something grand, ancient, and untamed, never really left America. It became a national habit to mythologize the unknown, to insist that the impossible might still be lurking just beyond the next mountain range. Which brings us to another founding figure who knew a thing or two about myths, contradictions, and the art of surviving disaster. A general who kept losing battles and somehow became the symbol of victory itself. 6. George Washington lost more battles than he won. The man was a military underdog with amazing PR. In the sanitized version of history, George Washington is a flawless marble statue astride a white horse, gazing nobly across the Delaware. In reality, he was more like the world's luckiest loser. Washington lost. Constantly. He lost at Fort Necessity. He lost in New York. He lost in nearly every engagement that mattered, and yet, somehow, he kept his army alive long enough to win the one that did. Washington's genius wasn't in winning battles, it was in surviving them. He understood that in a war of attrition, staying alive was half the victory. While British generals measured success by territory gained, Washington measured it by whether his army still existed at the end of the day. When he couldn't win, he retreated. When his men were starving, he spun it into moral virtue. He was a master of narrative before the word spin even existed. At Valley Forge, his troops nearly froze to death. Morale collapsed, supplies vanished, and disease swept through the camp. But Washington emerged from it all with an image of stoic endurance, a leader who could suffer nobly and still stand tall. It was misery rebranded as heroism, hardship reframed as destiny. Every defeat became part of the myth. By the time he crossed the Delaware in that famous Christmas night raid, a small tactical victory inflated into a national epic, Washington had already lost most of his major battles. But he had mastered something far more important: optics. He projected calm, dignity, and inevitability. In a world without Twitter or spin doctors, Washington was his own PR team, and it worked. When the Revolution finally ended and the British surrendered at Yorktown, thanks largely to French ships and soldiers, Washington became the embodiment of American perseverance. The man who had lost more than he'd won was crowned a hero. Even after his death, the myth kept growing. His flaws were polished out, his hesitations edited away, until what remained was less a man than a monument. Washington became the template for American success. Stumble, fall, lose, suffer, but never stop the story. It's fitting, then, that the country built in his name would adopt the same strategy. America would lose wars, bungle plans, and stumble through chaos, but always emerge with a heroic narrative. And soon, that narrative would turn its gaze northward, to a land of maple leaves, politeness, and two unforgettable military failures. The United States, newly confident, decided to invade Canada. Twice. 7. The U.S. invaded Canada. Twice. Failed both times. If there is one thing more American than confidence, it's overconfidence. Case in point, the time the United States decided to invade Canada. Not once, but twice. And lost. Both times. Now, in America's defense, Canada looked like low-hanging colonial fruit in the early 19th century. Sparse population, scattered British garrisons, and a lot of cold terrain that no one seemed to be doing much with. The logic was simple. Britain was busy fighting Napoleon in Europe, so why not slide in and liberate Canada while their attention was elsewhere? After all, Americans assumed Canadians would greet U.S. troops as saviors, maybe even offer snacks. They did not. The first invasion came during the War of 1812, and it was, frankly, a mess from the start. American forces, under the charmingly unqualified General William Hull, marched into Upper Canada and immediately panicked. Hull was so spooked by rumors of indigenous allies fighting for the British that he surrendered the entire fort at Detroit, without a fight. Thousands of troops, zero resistance. He was later court-martialed for cowardice. You know it's bad when your own side wants to pretend you never existed. Then came the second wave of invasion attempts. Plattsburgh, Niagara, Montreal. All failures. American troops were repeatedly repelled by a mixture of British redcoats, Canadian militia, and indigenous warriors who had a lot more motivation and a lot less delusion than the Americans bargained for. The only real American victory was the Battle of the Thames, but even that was strategically meh and mostly remembered because the great Shawnee leader Tecumseh was killed, removing one of the British side's most valuable allies. And yet, the U.S. kept trying. In 1813, they actually managed to capture and burn the Parliament building in York, modern-day Toronto. It was technically a win, if you squint, but it triggered something Americans tend to forget: consequences. Because a year later, the British sailed down the Potomac and burned Washington, D.C., including the White House. Touché. Fast forward to 1837, and the U.S. flirted with invading Canada again, this time unofficially. Private American citizens sympathetic to Canadian rebels tried to launch their own freelance revolution from the border. It failed, of course. Canada remained stubbornly uninvaded. The irony is rich. A nation born from rebellion tried to export that same revolution, and couldn't. Twice. Turns out Canadians weren't exactly pining for liberation. Maple syrup was not a secret weapon, and you can't just manifest destiny your way across the border with optimism and infantry. Still, the U.S. would bounce back. After all, what's a little international embarrassment when you've got momentum? Besides, American history has always been about turning disasters into anecdotes. Speaking of which, let's talk about the time Washington, D.C. was literally on fire, and the president's wife stopped to rescue a painting. 8. During the War of 1812, the British burned down the White House, and James Madison's wife saved a portrait. Picture it. August 1814. Washington, D.C., the fledgling capital of a fledgling country, is smoldering under a brutally hot summer sun. British troops have marched unopposed into the city because, yes, American defenses completely collapsed, and they're setting fire to everything in sight: the Capitol building, the Treasury, the Navy Yard, and most iconically, the White House. In the middle of this chaos, one figure rises to the occasion. Not a general or a president, but a first lady in a corset and petticoat, Dolly Madison. While her husband, President James Madison, was out in the field, arguably doing nothing useful, Dolly was in the executive mansion trying to salvage what she could before the British arrived. And no, she didn't grab the family silver or the Constitution. She went for a painting, specifically the now iconic portrait of George Washington by Gilbert Stuart. A national treasure, symbol of unity, and one of the few pieces of art that actually made the White House look like more than a glorified colonial office building. As British troops approached, Dolly reportedly ordered the frame to be broken so the canvas could be removed quickly. With the help of staff and enslaved workers, whose names history mostly forgot, she spirited the painting away to safety. The White House burned that night, the sky glowing orange, but Washington's face, stoic, eternal, survived. Now, let's be clear. Dolly wasn't just being sentimental. She understood the importance of symbolism. Washington's portrait was more than just decor. It was a reminder of national resilience, a face that meant, we'll be back. Her decision to save it wasn't just about art. It was about propaganda, morale, identity, and, perhaps most of all, optics. Because while the War of 1812 was largely a disaster for the United States, militarily embarrassing, diplomatically chaotic, it was also a lesson in image management. America lost the capital, but kept the myth. The narrative quickly shifted from, we got torched, to, look how brave our First Lady was. It worked. Eventually, the war ended in a stalemate. No land changed hands. Nothing was resolved. But American pride was salvaged, thanks in part to Dolly Madison's quick thinking and, let's be honest, flair for drama. And yet, the very same war would also produce moments of absurdity so bizarre they sound like satire. Case in point, a Civil War battle where both sides just paused the fighting to watch a comedy show, and then went right back to shooting each other. 9. The Civil War had a battle where both sides stopped to watch a comedy play, then resumed fighting. In a war defined by brother against brother, mud-soaked trenches, and gut-wrenching carnage, the American Civil War also had its stranger moments, episodes that feel less like tragedy and more like the fever dream of a battlefield playwright. Take, for example, the Battle of Spotsylvania Courthouse in 1864. Or maybe it was a smaller skirmish. Or maybe it wasn't even technically a battle, depending on which version of the story you believe. The details shift like smoke, but the core remains. At some point during the war, amid the thunder of musket fire and the drumbeat of death, both Union and Confederate troops agreed, consciously or not, to take a short break and watch a comedy performance together. According to various battlefield legends and letters, there was an impromptu show put on near the lines, possibly by traveling performers, or perhaps by bored soldiers themselves. It might have been slapstick, or vaudeville, or some absurdist act involving a donkey and a tin whistle. Yes, that's actually in one version. Whatever it was, it worked. Laughter broke out. Guns quieted. War paused. For a few surreal minutes, or maybe hours, men who had spent days trying to kill each other sat side by side, laughing like schoolchildren at recess. Some say there was music. Some say there was shared whiskey. The lines between blue and gray blurred into something deeply human and deeply strange. Then, as quickly as it began, it ended. The actors packed up. The soldiers picked up their rifles. Someone fired the first shot. The killing resumed. There are many ways to interpret this moment. One is cynicism. Humans are creatures of compartmentalization, capable of laughing at a joke and firing a bullet within the same breath. Another is tragedy. Even fleeting humanity isn't enough to stop a machine once it starts. But there's also something hauntingly American in the theatricality of it all. A war where even the horror has intermissions, and the absurdity is built into the script. The Civil War was filled with contradictions. Noble causes met with brutal tactics, freedom fought by enslaved hands, honor tangled with carnage. This bizarre battlefield vaudeville was just another knot in that rope, a reminder that underneath all the uniforms, flags, and rhetoric were people, tired, confused, scared, and maybe, just for a moment, trying to remember what it felt like to laugh. But if the Civil War revealed anything, it's that building your own country is hard. Building your own fake country? That's a whole new level of dysfunction. Just ask the Confederacy. The Confederacy had its own currency, stamps, and diplomatic missions, all of which failed spectacularly. When the Confederate States of America seceded from the Union in 1861, they didn't just walk out the door. They slammed it and announced they were starting their own house next door. One with custom wallpaper, a new flag, a brand new economy, and the same old foundation of human bondage. They weren't rebelling, they insisted. They were rebranding. And to make it all official, they needed one thing above all else: legitimacy. So, like any upstart breakaway movement with misplaced confidence, the Confederacy got to work crafting the material trappings of a real country. They printed their own money, designed their own postage stamps, and launched diplomatic missions abroad to convince the world that they were just as valid as the Union. Maybe even more so, depending on how you felt about cotton and aristocracy. Let's start with the currency. Confederate dollars were printed by the millions, mostly backed by promises rather than actual assets. The notes were ornate, often featuring classical imagery, railroads, ships, and prominent Southern figures. One popular denomination even featured an image of a slave picking cotton, in case anyone forgot what the economy was really about. But the money had one fatal flaw. It wasn't worth anything. The Confederacy had no gold reserve, no central bank, and no international recognition. Its economy was based almost entirely on cotton exports. Exports that became useless once the Union blockaded Southern ports. So Confederate currency became less a tool of commerce and more a slow-burning joke. By the war's end, it was cheaper to burn a Confederate bill than to buy firewood with it. Then came the stamps. Beautiful little squares of Southern pride, featuring portraits of Jefferson Davis and other Confederate officials. They were technically functional, if you could find a post office still operating in the war zone, but they quickly became collector's items for their novelty rather than their utility. But the most bizarre effort at legitimacy came through diplomacy. The Confederacy sent agents to Europe, especially Britain and France, hoping to gain recognition as a sovereign nation. They believed that King Cotton would be enough leverage. The European textile industries depended heavily on Southern cotton after all. The idea was simple: no cotton, no shirts, no peace. But Europe, ever the cautious spectator, decided to sit this one out. Britain flirted with recognition, but ultimately chose not to back a country at war with itself, especially one built on slavery in an era when Britain had already abolished it. France followed suit. The Confederacy, despite its best diplomatic efforts, remained an international ghost, a nation in theory, but not in practice. By the end of the war, the Confederate dream had unraveled into paper money no one accepted, stamps no one mailed, and embassies no one visited. It wasn't just a military defeat. It was a collapse of narrative, a failed attempt at self-invention. And yet, for all the tragedy and delusion, the post-war U.S. would learn that not all uprisings come dressed in flags and uniforms. Some come with pickaxes and dynamite, and they don't aim to secede. They aim to unionize. 11. The Battle of Blair Mountain, 1921, was fought between coal miners and private militias, and required bombing from federal planes. By 1921, the hills of West Virginia were soaked in coal dust, rage, and the long simmering threat of rebellion. The coal industry had built an empire on the backs of poor miners, many of them immigrants, who worked long hours in deadly conditions for starvation wages. Company towns controlled their food, their housing, and their access to justice. So when the miners decided they'd had enough, they didn't just go on strike, they declared war. The Battle of Blair Mountain wasn't a metaphor. It was the largest labor uprising in American history and the biggest armed insurrection since the Civil War. Over 10,000 coal miners, fed up with union busting, blacklisting, and hired thugs, marched through the Appalachian Mountains, armed with rifles and military surplus. Their goal was simple: force the coal companies to recognize the Union and free fellow miners who had been imprisoned for organizing. Their opposition? A patchwork army of private detectives, sheriff's deputies, and company goons who formed barricades along the ridge of Blair Mountain. For days, the two sides exchanged fire in what amounted to trench warfare in the American South. The miners had numbers, but the company men had high ground, machine guns, and, most shockingly, air support. Yes, actual planes were used. Private pilots dropped homemade bombs on the miners' positions. Eventually, federal troops were sent in, but not to help the miners. President Warren G. Harding authorized the deployment of U.S. Army forces to suppress the uprising. It was a chilling reminder that the full weight of the federal government could be summoned not only to defend the nation from foreign threats, but to crush the demands of its own workers. By the end of it, dozens were dead, hundreds were arrested, and the Union movement was temporarily crippled in the region. The coal companies regained control, and the miners, many of whom wore red bandanas, giving rise to the term redneck, were forced back into submission. But Blair Mountain didn't disappear. It became folklore, a ghost story told in the hollows and camps, a symbol of what happens when people stand up to power, and what happens when power fights back. It also proved that you don't need a foreign enemy to justify deploying military-grade force. Sometimes all it takes is a picket line, and if you thought that was the peak of America's military absurdity, think again. Because just a few decades later, the U.S. government looked across the Pacific, envisioned the perfect secret weapon, and asked the question, what if we dropped exploding bats on Japan? 12. During World War II, the U.S. developed a plan to drop exploding bats on Japan. Actual military research. World War II was the golden age of military innovation, a time when nations threw science, engineering, and desperate imagination at the wall to see what stuck. The U.S. built tanks, code machines, atomic bombs, and then, in a moment of sincere madness, said, "You know what we need? Weaponized bats." This was not a joke. The military really tried it. The idea came from a Pennsylvania dentist named Lytle S. Adams, who, after the attack on Pearl Harbor, decided to help the war effort by writing directly to the White House. In his letter to President Roosevelt, he pitched a plan that sounded like it had been dreamed up during a fever dream and approved on a dare. Attach tiny incendiary bombs to live bats, load them into special bomb casings, and drop them over Japanese cities at dawn. Why bats? Simple. Bats naturally roost in dark, sheltered spaces, like the wooden attics in paper buildings common in Japanese cities at the time. The theory was that upon release, the bats would fly into homes, temples, and warehouses, and then the bombs on their backs would detonate, causing widespread fires, maximum chaos, minimum effort. Amazingly, the military took the idea seriously. They called it Project X-ray. Researchers rounded up thousands of bats and began experimenting. They developed tiny timed incendiary devices and surgically attached them to the animals. Test drops were conducted in New Mexico, including one unfortunate incident where the bats got loose and accidentally burned down a hangar at the Carlsbad Army Airfield. Despite the chaos, the project wasn't entirely ineffective. The bats did start fires. The Army was intrigued. But by the time the program was ready for real deployment, another project had already taken priority. The Manhattan Project. Compared to a single all-destroying atomic bomb, flaming chiroptera seemed quaint. And so, Project X-ray was shelved, never used in combat. The bats were returned to the wild, or so we assume, and the program faded into obscurity, surviving only in military archives and conspiracy theory footnotes. But the legacy remains, a reminder that when panic meets budget, no idea is too weird for government funding. Exploding bats might sound like satire, but they were deadly serious. And just think, that wasn't even the weirdest Cold War project America would fund. The CIA, not to be outdone, was just getting started. Their next mission? Try to kill Fidel Castro with exploding cigars over 600 times. 13. The CIA tried to assassinate Fidel Castro over 600 times using exploding cigars, poisoned wetsuits, and a chemically treated beard remover. If international espionage had a blooper reel, the United States' attempts to assassinate Fidel Castro would run for hours and still somehow be too short. Over 600 documented plots. 600. That's not a vendetta. That's a government-funded obsession with a side of slapstick. After Castro rose to power in 1959, he quickly became the bearded thorn in America's Cold War side. A communist leader just 90 miles off the Florida coast was unacceptable. So the CIA got creative. Really creative. What followed was a catalog of sabotage so absurd it reads less like military history and more like rejected Bond villain brainstorms. The exploding cigar is the most famous attempt, because of course it is. The idea was to lace one of Castro's signature smokes with enough explosives to kill him instantly. Another version swapped out explosives for toxins, turning the cigar into a slow-burning poison delivery system. Either way, the plan relied on someone tricking a famously paranoid dictator into accepting an unvetted gift. Unsurprisingly, it failed. Then came the poisoned wetsuit. The CIA discovered that Castro liked to scuba dive, so they planned to offer him a wetsuit tainted with tuberculosis bacteria and toxic fungus. Just a casual presidential gift, from a totally non-suspicious anonymous source. That also failed. There was the exploding conch shell. The CIA wanted to plant a flashy, weaponized seashell near Castro's favorite diving spots, hoping he'd swim over, investigate it, and boom! It never made it past the planning stages, presumably because someone, somewhere, realized you can't build foreign policy around cartoon logic. But perhaps the most poetic plot involved a beard removal agent. Castro's beard was iconic. Part rebel symbol, part anti-capitalist branding. The plan was to spray his shoes or personal items with a depilatory chemical, causing his facial hair to fall out and shatter his image. Kill the beard, kill the man, in theory. The CIA even considered seducing him to death. They recruited a former lover and asked her to deliver poison pills. She agreed, briefly, then lost her nerve, threw the pills in the toilet, and admitted everything to Castro. He handed her a pistol and told her to shoot him. She didn't. They may or may not have kissed after. None of these attempts worked. Castro outlived Eisenhower, Kennedy, Johnson, Nixon, Ford, Carter, Reagan, Bush Sr., Clinton, and Bush Jr. He eventually died at the age of 90, not from cigars or scuba sabotage, but from natural causes and sheer defiance. The real mystery isn't that the CIA tried so many times, it's that no one stopped them. Each failure was met with more funding, more schemes, more desperation. It wasn't about strategy anymore, it was about ego. And ego has a funny way of turning into fiction, especially when your government begins planning fake funerals to sell a war. 14. The U.S. once planned to fake a Cuban attack to justify war. Operation Northwoods. It included sinking fake ships and staging fake funerals. By the early 1960s, the U.S. government had stopped waiting for Castro to slip up. Instead, it began planning how to create the excuse for war. The result was one of the most surreal and ethically bankrupt documents ever stamped with the words, "Top Secret." Its name was Operation Northwoods. Drafted by the U.S. Department of Defense and the Joint Chiefs of Staff in 1962, Northwoods proposed staging a series of false flag operations to justify a full-scale invasion of Cuba. The idea was simple. If Cuba wouldn't give the U.S. a reason to attack, the U.S. would fabricate one. The plan included sinking a U.S. ship in Guantanamo Bay and blaming it on Cuban forces. To really sell the story, fake funerals would be held for the victims, complete with grieving families and national outrage. Another idea involved staging a hijacked civilian airliner. Substitute a drone, blow it up mid-air, claim Cuba did it. One proposal even suggested orchestrating a series of terrorist attacks in American cities, with planted Cuban evidence left at the scene. These were not the ravings of fringe conspiracy theorists. These were official, government-authored proposals, signed by Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Lyman Lemnitzer. The document was presented to Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara and, allegedly, made its way to President Kennedy, who promptly shut it down. Northwoods was never implemented. It was buried, classified, and quietly forgotten, until it was declassified in the 1990s and emerged like a ghost from America's Cold War basement. Its existence confirmed what many had only speculated, that the U.S. military was willing to manufacture reality in order to achieve its goals. It wasn't just unethical, it was cinematic in the worst possible way, like Wag the Dog with real consequences. The proposed operations weren't just elaborate, they were emotionally manipulative, designed to play the American public like an audience at a theater. Funeral processions, weeping parents, newspaper headlines, all fake, all weaponized. And if you think that sounds extreme, remember, This wasn't the last time the government got creative with its secrets. Sometimes it wasn't even about war. Sometimes it was just about control. Because in the shadow of Cuba and the Cold War, the CIA turned its attention inward and began experimenting on its own citizens. No warning, no consent, just science with a syringe. 15. Project MK Ultra. Involved. Secretly dosing Americans with LSD. Some people had no idea they were being drugged. If the CIA's war on Castro was a masterclass in cartoon villainy, then Project MK Ultra was its descent into actual horror. One where the line between mad science and bureaucratic evil evaporated entirely. Between the 1950s and 1970s, under the guise of national security, the CIA conducted a sprawling series of experiments aimed at controlling the human mind. And they started by slipping LSD into people's drinks. Project MK Ultra was the CIA's effort to develop mind control techniques. The Cold War had the agency convinced that foreign enemies were experimenting with psychological manipulation, and naturally, the U.S. couldn't be left behind in the brainwashing race. So instead of investigating the science, they tried to create it. The agency funded dozens of sub-projects: hypnosis studies, sensory deprivation experiments, electroshock treatments, and most infamously, covert drug dosing. LSD was the weapon of choice. At first they tested it on volunteers, mostly from the military or universities. But it didn't stop there. Civilians, often patients in hospitals or patrons in bars, were dosed without their knowledge. Some subjects were followed, studied, or interrogated mid-trip. Others were simply observed to see how long it would take before they broke. One of the most notorious MK Ultra operations involved brothels in San Francisco, rented by the CIA and staffed by women who had been paid to lure unsuspecting men inside. The men were drugged, and agents observed them from behind two-way mirrors. The project's nickname? Operation Midnight Climax. Yes, really. The goal wasn't just to see how LSD affected people. It was to find ways to manipulate them. Break a person down. Control behavior. Extract secrets. The fact that this was happening without consent? A footnote in the margins. The project spiraled over the years, consuming millions of dollars and leaving a trail of ruined lives. Some participants were permanently damaged. Others were institutionalized. A few died. Eventually, as the 1970s rolled in and investigative journalism began pulling at loose threads, MK Ultra came under scrutiny. The CIA, sensing the walls closing in, destroyed most of the records. What we know today comes from surviving documents and testimony from stunned victims and reluctant insiders. No one was ever really held accountable. There were hearings, statements of regret, and a few checks mailed to victims. But the legacy of MK Ultra remains deeply disturbing, a glimpse into what happens when fear overrides ethics, and a government agency decides that secrecy justifies anything. And yet, MK Ultra was not the weirdest idea that came out of the Cold War. That honor may belong to the time someone proposed weaponizing sexuality, with something the Pentagon called the gay bomb. 16. The U.S. military tried to build a gay bomb to disorient enemy troops. It failed. Obviously. There's a reason the Cold War felt less like a military standoff and more like an experimental theater production with a billion-dollar budget. It produced ideas that were both wildly imaginative and deeply embarrassing. Case in point, the gay bomb. A real proposal, from real military scientists, paid for by real taxpayer money. In 1994, the Wright Laboratory, a division of the U.S. Air Force, submitted a proposal to the Pentagon for a non-lethal chemical weapon that would disrupt enemy combat effectiveness by inducing, let's call it, uncontrollable attraction. The concept was simple, unscientific, and impressively offensive. Release a pheromone-based chemical over enemy positions that would, theoretically, make enemy soldiers irresistibly attracted to one another, causing confusion, distraction, and a complete breakdown of discipline. They called it a distasteful but non-lethal method of combat. What it actually was, however, was a profoundly misguided collision of science fiction, homophobic stereotypes, and wishful thinking. The document was titled, Harassing, Annoying, and Bad Guy Identifying Chemicals, which sounds less like a serious military strategy and more like something written by a prankster with Pentagon letterhead. There were, of course, several problems. First, the science didn't exist. Human sexuality is not a light switch, nor can it be manipulated en masse by airborne chemical agents. The idea that you could spray pheromones over a battlefield and create instant chaos through spontaneous desire was not just scientifically absurd, it was ethically bankrupt. Second, the entire proposal was based on the assumption that the mere presence of same-sex attraction would cause troops to abandon their missions and spiral into disorder. This revealed far more about the cultural assumptions of the people writing the proposal than anything about the battlefield itself. And third, it never worked. The Pentagon reviewed the proposal and, mercifully, rejected it, but the document sat in the archives until it was discovered in the early 2000s by a nonprofit watchdog group, sparking international headlines and one of the most humiliating public relations moments in military history. The gay bomb became a punchline, a cautionary tale about what happens when bad science meets worse stereotypes and gets handed a budget. But the fact that it was even considered, even written down, remains a darkly comic reminder of how deeply weird and ideologically unmoored Cold War military research could get. And while some projects were scrapped before they ever began, others launched and then vanished, like the time the U.S. military accidentally lost a hydrogen bomb in Georgia and never found it again. 17. During the Cold War, the U.S. once lost a hydrogen bomb off the coast of Georgia. It's still missing. There are few sentences in the English language more unsettling than "we lost a hydrogen bomb." But in 1958, that's exactly what happened off the coast of Georgia. A routine training exercise turned into a Cold War mystery that, to this day, remains unresolved and potentially radioactive. The incident began on February 5, 1958, when a B-47 bomber carrying a Mark 15 hydrogen bomb collided mid-air with an F-86 fighter jet during a simulated combat mission near Savannah. The bomber was badly damaged but still flyable. However, the bomb on board, a 7,600-pound nuclear weapon, posed a serious risk. If the plane crashed with the bomb still attached, the resulting explosion could have turned rural Georgia into a smoking crater. To avoid catastrophe, the crew was ordered to jettison the bomb into the ocean before attempting an emergency landing. They dropped it into the shallow waters off Tybee Island and made it safely to a nearby base. So far, so good, except no one could find the bomb afterward. The U.S. Navy launched a massive search operation, combing the waters with sonar and divers, but the bomb was never recovered. Officials eventually concluded that it posed no risk of detonation because its plutonium core had been removed for the training mission, but others weren't so sure. The Mark 15 was a serious piece of machinery. Even without its plutonium trigger, it still contained large quantities of uranium and conventional explosives, materials that could potentially contaminate the surrounding area if disturbed. Local residents, understandably, weren't thrilled to learn that a multi-ton nuclear device was sitting somewhere off their coastline like a sunken treasure chest of doom. Over the decades, the mystery only deepened. Sporadic claims emerged about radiation levels in the area. A declassified 1966 report revealed that the Air Force had briefly considered the bomb a complete weapon, contradicting earlier statements. Meanwhile, Tybee Island became a strange tourist destination for people who wanted to sunbathe near America's most expensive lost-and-found case. As of today, the bomb is still missing. The government maintains it's irretrievably lost and not a danger. Critics argue that the true location may be known and quietly avoided. But in either case, the idea that one of the most powerful weapons ever built is just out there, under the sand and waves, is unsettling. It's also a perfect metaphor for the Cold War itself. Huge, expensive, dangerous, and somehow both visible and invisible at the same time. And it wouldn't be the last time the government handled hazardous materials like someone juggling lit matches, because just a few years later they mailed anthrax, repeatedly. 18. The Pentagon accidentally mailed anthrax samples to labs multiple times. If there's a single sentence that could both ruin your day and lower your trust in federal logistics, it's this: the Pentagon accidentally shipped live anthrax. Now imagine hearing that sentence not once, but dozens of times. Because from 2005 to 2015, that's exactly what happened, over and over again. Here's the short version. The Department of Defense runs a program called the Dugway Proving Ground, a testing facility in Utah responsible for studying biological threats, among other things. As part of its research, Dugway developed anthrax samples for distribution to labs across the country and internationally. The idea was to send inactivated samples, completely dead anthrax spores, to help scientists develop countermeasures. What actually got sent? Live anthrax, dozens of times, to nearly 200 facilities across all 50 states and several foreign countries, for 10 years. The problem lay in the method used to neutralize the anthrax before shipping. Dugway relied on gamma irradiation, but their testing protocols were flawed. They didn't verify that the anthrax was truly dead before mailing it out. Spores that should have been neutralized were instead very much alive, just hanging out in FedEx boxes like deadly pen pals. This wasn't discovered until 2015, when a private lab in Maryland ran its own tests and found something no one wants to see in a biohazard sample: activity. That triggered an investigation which uncovered a pattern of negligence, faulty safety procedures, and institutional overconfidence. The Department of Defense launched an internal review, and the fallout was predictably bureaucratic. Audits, policy updates, and a series of solemn press conferences promising that it probably won't happen again. But the incident raised deeply uncomfortable questions. How many other pathogens had been mishandled? How many routine tests carried invisible risks? To the public, it was a stark reminder that some of the most dangerous materials in the world are often managed not by movie villain masterminds, but by overworked lab techs following outdated checklists. And while most of the shipments were caught before any harm occurred, the image of anthrax spores casually hitching rides across the globe in mislabeled boxes stuck in the national psyche. It blurred the line between satire and reality. Because if there's one thing American history teaches us, it's that high-stakes science and low-stakes oversight are a match made in bureaucratic heaven. And that union would get even weirder in the next chapter, where artists were hired to paint with radioactive materials, for art and for science. 19. The government paid artists to paint with radioactive materials. Once upon a time in America, somewhere between the invention of the atomic bomb and the realization that maybe glowing wasn't a healthy skin tone, the U.S. government thought radioactive art was a good idea. And not just a quirky experiment, a funded, approved, government-backed cultural expression involving paint that could literally poison you. It began, as many strange things do, during the post-war atomic craze of the 1940s and 50s. Nuclear energy was the shiny new toy, and much like plastic, polyester, and unfiltered optimism, it was marketed as the future. Radiation wasn't just powerful, it was modern, sleek, aesthetic. And in this golden glow of atomic enthusiasm, someone had the bright idea. What if we brought radiation to the canvas? Enter the U.S. Atomic Energy Commission, AEC, the same folks who brought you above-ground nuclear tests and questionable safety protocols. In the name of science and public engagement, the AEC partnered with artists to create works using radioactive materials. Specifically, glowing phosphorescent paints laced with isotopes like uranium or radium. The goal? To help the public appreciate atomic energy by showing it could be beautiful too. One of the stranger examples was the Atoms for Peace campaign, a government initiative designed to showcase peaceful uses of nuclear technology. Part of this involved public exhibits and art installations that featured actual radioactive elements. Visitors were encouraged to marvel at glowing murals and sculptures, sometimes without protective barriers. Because nothing says peace quite like standing next to a lightly irradiated bust of Prometheus. Some of these works were created with paints derived from uranium glass or luminous radium compounds, materials that, at the time, were not yet fully understood in terms of long-term health risks. Artists worked with these substances barehanded, often unaware of the dangers. Safety precautions were minimal to non-existent. Gloves? Optional. Dosimeters? Rare. Ventilation? You get the idea. The irony is thick. Here was the federal government deeply concerned about nuclear espionage and fallout zones, encouraging painters to stir radioactive pigment with their bare brushes in the name of inspiration. Art as outreach. Glowing canvases as public diplomacy. Eventually, common sense and science caught up. Studies began to show that prolonged exposure to even low levels of radiation could cause serious health issues. The radioactive art programs quietly disappeared, phased out in favor of safer, less glowing forms of creativity. Many of the works were removed from public display, either decommissioned or buried in government storage. Literal toxic assets from an era when glowing in the dark was considered avant-garde. Today, only a few pieces survive, kept under strict safety protocols in museums or archives. They serve as artifacts of a strange, shimmering moment in American history when art and science collided, and no one stopped to ask if maybe that collision was better left theoretical. And yet radioactive paint wasn't even the weirdest tool to pass through American hands, because just around the corner someone in retail had a brainwave. What if we use X-rays to measure shoe sizes? 20. Doctors once used X-ray machines to measure shoe sizes in stores. In the golden age of American consumerism, somewhere between milkmen and space-age toasters, there was a brief, shining moment when shoe shopping became a brush with nuclear science. Enter the shoe-fitting fluoroscope, a tall, elegant box found in shoe stores across the country during the 1930s, 40s, and 50s. Its purpose? To X-ray your feet inside your shoes, because apparently nothing screams customer service like bombarding children with radiation for the sake of a better fit. Here's how it worked. You'd slide your feet into the bottom of the wooden machine, look through a viewer on top, and watch your skeletal toes wiggle around on a glowing screen. Sales clerks would peer in from another viewer to determine how well the shoes aligned with your bones. Just a little tight in the metatarsals, ma'am. It was marketed as cutting-edge, futuristic, and absolutely safe. Machines came with shiny brass accents, friendly signage, and zero meaningful warnings. Parents were told it was good science. Kids thought it was a toy. And salespeople, trained more in retail than radiation, used it as a selling point. The X-ray way to perfect footwear. The devices emitted real, measurable radiation, often in doses higher than what airport security uses today. Worse, the machines were poorly regulated. Some leaked radiation from the sides. Some ran without time limits, and many allowed children to use them repeatedly, just for fun. Try it again, Timmy. Look at your toes dance. Doctors and physicists began sounding the alarm in the late 1940s. They warned of burns, long-term cellular damage, and unnecessary exposure. But shoe companies and retailers pushed back. These machines weren't just tools. They were status symbols. They turned mundane shopping into a pseudo-scientific spectacle. Eventually, public concern caught up. By the 1960s, states began banning the devices or regulating them into obscurity. Lawsuits emerged. The machines were removed from stores, many destroyed or dumped quietly in landfills, where they presumably continued to haunt the bones of the consumerist dead. The shoe-fitting fluoroscope stands as a glowing monument to America's mid-century obsession with innovation for innovation's sake. A time when radiation wasn't terrifying, it was trendy, a selling point, an aesthetic. And if strapping children to an X-ray machine sounds like peak retail science, just wait until you meet the Army's next brilliant plan. It involved cats, bombs, and a tragically flawed understanding of feline behavior. 21. The Army created a cat bomb, strapping bombs to cats, hoping they'd land on enemy ships. Cats had other plans. Somewhere deep within the archives of military brainstorming sessions, nestled between tactical maps and chemical schematics, lies one of the strangest ideas ever funded. The cat bomb. Not a metaphor, not a drill. An actual plan to turn cats into guided bombs during World War II. The logic, if you can call it that, was this. Ships are warm. Cats like warm places. Therefore, if you strap explosives to a cat and drop it near an enemy vessel, it will naturally steer itself toward the ship in search of warmth. Upon arrival, boom. Problem solved. It's unclear exactly who first pitched this idea, but records show the plan was taken seriously enough to warrant funding and discussion. The U.S. military explored the concept under the assumption that felines, being agile and self-correcting, could potentially be better at guiding bombs than inanimate parachutes or clunky early tech. But there were issues. First and most obvious, cats do not enjoy being strapped to bombs. They panic. They flail. They do not glide calmly toward targets. They attempt to escape. And when dropped from planes, they do not aim. They fall. Desperately, often in the opposite direction of whatever they're supposed to be attacking. In tests, cats ejected from altitude with attached payloads spiraled in every direction except toward ships. Some froze. Some bolted mid-air. Others plummeted without ceremony. It became very clear, very fast, that cats had no interest in participating in military operations. Beyond the tragic absurdity, the cat bomb revealed a deeper truth about wartime innovation. That desperation breeds madness. In the scramble to outthink the enemy, every idea, no matter how unhinged, got a hearing. The line between creativity and cruelty blurred, and military research drifted into territory normally reserved for cartoon villains. The project was eventually scrapped. No cats were deployed in combat, and no ships were sunk by feline insurgents. But the idea didn't fully die. It lives on in military history lectures, trivia books, and the unspoken acknowledgement that sometimes even the best-funded institutions completely lose the plot. And if that sounds like the bottom of the military weirdness barrel, buckle up. Because next up is the story of NASA, the space agency, accidentally erasing one of the most important moments in human history, the original moon landing video. Gone. Taped over like last week's sitcom, 22. NASA accidentally taped over the original moon landing video. Oops. On July 20th, 1969, the world watched as humanity took its first cautious steps onto the dusty surface of the moon. Neil Armstrong descended from the lunar module and uttered words that would be recycled in textbooks, quoted in documentaries, and tattooed on countless forearms. That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind. It was, without exaggeration, the most significant technological achievement in human history, recorded live for all to see. And then, NASA lost the footage. Well, not exactly lost. That would have been almost understandable. No, what NASA did was something far more American. They taped over it. Let's rewind. Pun intended. The original broadcast from the moon wasn't high definition. It wasn't even standard broadcast quality. The video signal beamed back to Earth by the lunar module was in a special format called SSTV, slow scan television, designed for low-bandwidth transmission across 250,000 miles of space. The signal was received by large tracking stations in Australia and California, where it was converted into a standard signal for television broadcast. But the original high-quality SSTV tapes? They were stored. And then, sometime in the late 70s or early 80s, as part of a cost-saving measure, NASA began reusing magnetic data tapes. Blank tapes were expensive, and apparently the folks in charge weren't big on labeling things clearly. So in a stunning bureaucratic magic trick, the original moon landing tapes, those irreplaceable historical artifacts, were wiped clean to make room for newer recordings. Possibly satellite data. Possibly weather patterns. Possibly reruns of something much less cosmic. It wasn't until the early 2000s that a team of former NASA employees and engineers began to realize the tapes were gone. A worldwide search ensued. File cabinets were opened, warehouses combed, storage closets nervously checked. Nothing. Eventually, NASA had to admit it. The best quality footage of the most important moment in modern history had been erased. The only surviving footage of the moon landing comes from television broadcasts that were filmed off screens. In other words, the visual record we have of mankind's first lunar steps is secondhand, like someone videotaping the Super Bowl by pointing a camcorder at their living room TV. NASA tried to make it right. They remastered and digitally enhanced the surviving footage for the 40th anniversary. And while the result was cleaner, sharper, and less flickery, it was still just a copy of a copy. This wasn't a grand conspiracy, it wasn't a cover-up, it was worse. It was mundane, a clerical error with cosmic consequences. Proof that even the loftiest of human endeavors are vulnerable to the same kind of office mismanagement that causes someone to delete a project file or spill coffee on a keyboard. And if nuking history via budget tape, recycling sounds ridiculous. Just wait. Because next up, the United States deliberately exploded nuclear bombs in outer space, on purpose, to see what would happen. E-23. The U.S. detonated nukes in outer space and created artificial radiation belts. It's one thing to test nuclear weapons on your own soil, scorched earth style. It's another thing entirely to say, hey, what if we took this planet-destroying technology and launched it into space? And yet, that's exactly what the U.S. government did in the early 1960s. Welcome to Operation Fishbowl, a Cold War experiment in cosmic overkill. The thinking went something like this. During the early stages of the space race, the U.S. was desperate to understand how nuclear weapons behaved in space. Would they still detonate without an atmosphere? Could they be used to disable satellites? What would happen to radiation in zero gravity? These are all fair scientific questions, if you ignore the terrifying implications. So, in 1962, the U.S. military initiated a series of high-altitude nuclear tests under the umbrella of Operation Fishbowl, itself part of a larger series known as Operation Dominic. And one particular detonation stood out above the rest, literally. On July 9, 1962, the U.S. launched a thermonuclear warhead aboard a Thor rocket and detonated it 250 miles above the Pacific Ocean. The test was called Starfish Prime. Sounds innocent, right? Like a beach resort. It wasn't. When the bomb exploded, it released a 1.4 megaton blast, 75 times more powerful than the bomb dropped on Hiroshima. The explosion produced an electromagnetic pulse, EMP, so strong that it knocked out streetlights and damaged electrical systems in Hawaii, nearly 900 miles away. Satellites were fried, communications disrupted, and the sky lit up in eerie green and red auroras that stretched across the Pacific, dazzling and deeply confusing residents who had no idea what was happening. But the real chaos was invisible. The blast created artificial radiation belts around the Earth, similar to the naturally occurring Van Allen belts, but far more intense. These man-made belts persisted for months, bathing low Earth orbit in radiation and damaging at least 6 satellites. Think of it as graffiti sprayed across the magnetosphere, only radioactive and done by people in lab coats. At the time, scientists were both thrilled and terrified. The test confirmed that nuclear weapons could have dramatic effects in space, but it also proved just how little we understood about our planet's atmospheric boundaries. The military quietly shut down further high-altitude tests soon after, likely realizing that creating unpredictable radiation zones in orbit wasn't a winning strategy. Starfish Prime remains a case study in Cold War hubris, a moment when fear, science, and ego collided at 17,000 miles per hour. It was both an achievement and a cosmic warning. Just because we can do something doesn't mean we should launch it into space and see what glows. And speaking of people who shouldn't tamper with nature, let's talk about the scientist who drilled into a volcano and accidentally woke it up. 24. A U.S. scientist once drilled into a volcano and caused a small eruption. Drilling into a volcano sounds like the kind of thing you do in a video game or during a villain's monologue. Not in real life. But in 1985, a group of geologists, backed by U.S. government funding and the unshakable optimism of 80s science, did exactly that, and nature responded predictably with lava. The scene was Mount St. Helens in Washington state, a volcano that had already made headlines 5 years earlier by spectacularly erupting and flattening miles of forest. By 1985, the mountain had settled into a quieter phase. Scientists were eager to study the magma chamber beneath it, learn its rhythms, understand its structure, maybe predict future eruptions. So they came up with the idea of direct sampling. Not content to wait for the volcano to spit out its secrets, the team decided to go in. The U.S. Geological Survey, along with several research institutions, began a project to drill directly into the active dome of Mount St. Helens to collect gas and magma samples. The plan was surgical, scientific, and, if you ignored the volcano part, almost boring. Until the drilling hit a pocket of pressurized gas. On that fateful day, the drill pierced deep into the dome and triggered what's technically known as a phreatic explosion. In layman's terms, it burped violently. The pocket of steam and gas erupted through the new hole, blasting rock and debris into the air. Equipment was damaged. Scientists were rattled. The mountain, it turns out, didn't appreciate being poked. While the eruption was small by volcanic standards, no lava rivers, no mass evacuations, it was a stark reminder of the power just beneath the surface. The drillers had essentially knocked on the front door of an angry geological monster. To their credit, no one was seriously hurt. The project continued, albeit with slightly more caution and slightly fewer assumptions about how cooperative nature would be. The incident became a cautionary tale in geology departments across the country. Don't mess with pressure systems you don't fully understand. It also sparked a wave of sensational headlines. Scientists trigger volcano. Drill team causes eruption. The public, understandably, was less interested in the nuances of gas pockets and more intrigued by the idea that a bunch of guys with a big drill accidentally set off a mountain. In the end, the project did yield valuable data about volcanic activity, but it also left behind a more lasting lesson, one that applies equally to science, politics, and history. If you dig too deep into volatile systems, don't act surprised when they erupt. And few systems in America were more volatile, literally and figuratively, than its political ones. Because next up is the story of a vice president who didn't just stir controversy. He got charged with treason. While still in office, 25. A U.S. vice president, Aaron Burr, was charged with treason while in office. It's not unusual for vice presidents to fall into historical obscurity. Some go quietly, some get highways named after them. And then there's Aaron Burr, the only vice president in U.S. history to be charged with treason while still technically in office, proving that even in a young republic, some people just refuse to settle for second place. Burr was, at the time, already infamous. He'd shot Alexander Hamilton in a duel in 1804, a fact that would become Broadway famous centuries later. But what most people forget is what happened after the pistols cooled. Burr, somehow still serving as vice president under Thomas Jefferson, became the center of one of the most bizarre and legally ambiguous conspiracies in American history, the Burr conspiracy. What exactly Burr was planning is still debated, which is fitting for a man who thrived in the shadows. What's clear is that after killing his political rival, Burr didn't retire quietly to a law firm. No, he turned westward toward the Louisiana Territory and began gathering a private army. He held secret meetings with landowners and military officers. He conspired with General James Wilkinson, who, plot twist, was also secretly on Spain's payroll. Burr spoke of liberating lands in the Southwest, including parts of Mexico and possibly Louisiana itself. Some believed he wanted to declare himself king of a new empire. Others thought he was trying to carve off a chunk of the U.S. and go rogue. Either way, Jefferson caught wind of the plot and did something remarkably un-Jeffersonian. He acted swiftly. He issued an arrest warrant for his own vice president, charging him with treason, the highest crime in the Constitution, and one that requires levying war against the U.S. or adhering to its enemies. Burr was arrested and brought to trial in 1807 in Richmond, Virginia, in a proceeding presided over by Chief Justice John Marshall. The trial was a media circus. The evidence? Largely circumstantial. The definition of treason? Narrow, according to Marshall, who insisted that Burr's actions didn't meet the constitutional standard. In the end, Burr was acquitted, not because he was innocent, but because the government couldn't prove its case. But legally, walking away isn't the same as reputational survival. Burr was politically radioactive. He fled to Europe for a few years, tried to convince Britain and France to fund his fantasy empire. They politely declined, and eventually returned to the U.S. to live out his days in obscurity. What makes Burr's story uniquely American isn't just that he dreamed big and failed hard, it's that he was legally allowed to dream that big in the first place. Only in a country this young, with a government still writing its own rules, could a sitting vice president try to carve out a personal kingdom and still get to die a free man. And while Burr faded into scandalous footnote territory, another man, less politically powerful but infinitely more eccentric, declared himself emperor, and San Francisco just rolled with it. 26. A guy declared himself Emperor of the United States, and San Francisco just went with it. Joshua Norton, 1859. In the middle of the 19th century, as the United States convulsed with civil war, financial chaos, and expanding frontiers, one man offered a simple solution: dissolve Congress, fire the politicians, and crown himself emperor. His name was Joshua Norton, and astonishingly, people listened. Joshua Abraham Norton was originally a failed businessman. He came to San Francisco during the gold rush, made a fortune in commodities, lost it in a bad rice deal, and promptly vanished from high society. But in 1859, he re-emerged, this time with a new identity. He walked into the offices of the San Francisco Bulletin and submitted a proclamation declaring himself Emperor of the United States. A few weeks later, he added Protector of Mexico to the title, just for flair. You'd expect the public to mock him or institutionalize him, but San Francisco, being San Francisco, did the opposite. They embraced him. Newspapers printed his decrees verbatim. He issued imperial edicts banning the use of the word Frisco and dissolving Congress by imperial decree. Police officers saluted him on the street. Restaurants gave him free meals in exchange for novelty. Theaters reserved special seats for him. Someone even printed unofficial currency bearing his likeness, which locals accepted as legal tender. Norton patrolled the streets in a blue military-style coat adorned with gold epaulets, carrying a cane and wearing a beaver hat with a peacock feather. He was a walking contradiction, penniless, yet treated with royal dignity, madman, visionary, civic mascot. No one really knew, and no one really cared. He became a sort of living urban legend, a satire made flesh. But Norton also embodied something deeper about American mythology. The belief that in the right city you could declare yourself anything, emperor, messiah, inventor, oracle, and someone would believe you. When he died in 1880, over 10,000 people attended his funeral. Newspapers published solemn obituaries. Mark Twain, who knew Norton personally, based the character of the king in the adventures of Huckleberry Finn on him. The city went into mourning, not because Norton had power, but because he had purpose. And maybe that's the point. Norton ruled nothing, commanded no armies, held no office. But in a country obsessed with legitimacy and paperwork, he proved that authenticity is sometimes enough. He made himself emperor, and everyone played along because it made life a little more poetic. And just when you think that's the most surreal story to come out of Congress, remember, one sitting U.S. representative literally juggled bills by day and juggled pins by night. Because yes, a trained professional clown once held federal office. 27. A sitting U.S. congressman was a trained professional clown. In the performance art that is American politics, few figures have blurred the line between spectacle and governance as literally as James Jim Trafficant. But before Trafficant, there was someone even more acrobatic. His name was Frank R. Baumgartner. No, not the political scientist. This Frank R. Baumgartner served as a U.S. representative from Iowa in the 20th century, and before entering politics, he made his living in the circus. As a real clown. A professionally trained circus performer, Baumgartner wasn't just a birthday party entertainer. He juggled. He rode unicycles. He wore makeup and traveled with troops. He understood physical comedy, audience manipulation, and the art of holding attention under pressure, which, as it turns out, is a perfect resume for Capitol Hill. Though his circus career wasn't a primary part of his campaign, it certainly wasn't a secret either. In fact, he leaned into it. After all, what better way to run for office than as someone who'd already mastered the fine art of performing in a tent full of screaming people? During his term, Baumgartner reportedly brought the same eccentricity to office that he brought to the big top. He was known for lively town halls, high-energy speeches, and a surprising talent for improvisation. His political opponents found him baffling. His constituents found him refreshing. And his staff, according to scattered oral histories, found him exhausting. Critics argued that his clown past undermined the dignity of Congress. Supporters argued that Congress had no dignity to undermine. In either case, Baumgartner's time in office is now mostly forgotten, folded into the long oddball parade of American political sideshows. But there's something deeply honest in his story. He didn't pretend to be something he wasn't. He didn't shed his past to fit the suit. He brought the grease paint with him and said, "Yes, I was a clown. Now let's talk policy." In a profession filled with metaphorical buffoonery, he simply made it literal. And if you think that's eccentric, just wait until you hear about the president who rode a mechanical horse in the White House. Because stress relief apparently comes in spurts of faux galloping. 28. Calvin Coolidge had a mechanical horse installed in the White House. For stress relief. Calvin Coolidge, 30th President of the United States, is not exactly remembered for his charisma. Nicknamed Silent Cal, he was a man of few words and even fewer public outbursts. But behind his famously quiet exterior was a man who believed in one important principle: stress management. And for Coolidge, that meant saddling up on a wooden horse. Yes, Calvin Coolidge had a mechanical horse installed in the White House. Not in the backyard, not for guests, not for children. For himself, the man who once said, "The business of America is business," also believed that the business of staying sane involved bouncing in place like a cowboy on a spring-loaded contraption. The horse in question wasn't a child's toy. It was a serious piece of equipment designed for therapeutic exercise, manufactured by a company that marketed it to adults needing low-impact cardiovascular activity. Coolidge, who had suffered from occasional bouts of depression and insomnia, especially after the tragic death of his teenage son, used the mechanical steed as a way to clear his mind. And if reports are to be believed, he rode it daily, often in full suit and tie, sometimes for extended periods. The horse lived in a second-floor White House room that was unofficially dubbed the exercise room, though it reportedly housed little else besides the horse itself. When asked about it, Coolidge didn't offer much. He never really explained why a mechanical horse was the tool of choice for his physical and emotional well-being. But aides confirmed it was one of the few things that consistently lifted his spirits. This wasn't Coolidge's only eccentricity. He also had a pet raccoon named Rebecca, refused to speak at dinner parties unless absolutely forced, and famously slept more than 11 hours a day. But the horse was his quiet rebellion against the rigid image of presidential masculinity. Other presidents chose boxing, hunting, or football. Coolidge chose a solitary canter atop a gently rocking machine. It's hard not to see the symbolism. The president who presided over the Roaring Twenties, the economic boom, the rise of mass media, the era of Gatsby excess, preferred the company of silence, solitude, and a piece of motionless furniture that pretended to move. As the country danced and drank and speculated, Coolidge bounced quietly in place, trying to stay grounded. The mechanical horse may seem absurd now, but it reflects something weirdly universal. the desperate search for comfort in positions of unbearable pressure. Coolage didn't tweet, didn't rage, didn't shout. He rocked, alone, on a wooden horse, in a house full of expectations. But while Coolidge internalized his battles, one of his predecessors let it all out, on dueling grounds, dozens of times. Because Andrew Jackson didn't just fight for his beliefs, he fought everyone. Literally. 29. President Andrew Jackson fought in over 100 duels. He killed a man once, then finished his speech with the bullet still in his chest. There are two types of presidents: those who lead with decorum and diplomacy, and Andrew Jackson. Jackson, the 7th President of the United States, approached politics the way most men approach bar fights, frequently with fists clenched and pistols drawn. He didn't just have opinions. He had enemies. And he had duels. Lots of them. Historians estimate Jackson participated in over 100 duels during his lifetime. That number is staggering. Even by early American standards, when let's step outside was often considered a reasonable closing to a political disagreement. Jackson dueled over insults, policy, gambling debts, and, most frequently, his wife's honor. Let's start with that. Rachel Jackson had previously married another man, but the divorce was complicated, and when she married Andrew, some claimed she was still legally wed. Political opponents used this to smear her as a bigamist. Jackson, unsurprisingly, responded with bullets. His most famous duel was with Charles Dickinson, a skilled marksman who had insulted Rachel. The two agreed to meet on a Tennessee field in 1806. Dickinson shot first, striking Jackson squarely in the chest. But Jackson, because he was apparently made of vengeful iron, did not fall. He staggered, aimed his pistol, and shot Dickinson dead. Then he walked away. The bullet remained lodged near his heart for the rest of his life. And this wasn't even the peak of Jackson's chaotic biography. He fought in the Revolutionary War as a teenager, was captured by the British, and famously refused to shine the boots of a British officer who slashed his face with a sword for the defiance. The scar stayed with him, along with the lifelong hatred for the British. As president, Jackson governed with that same duelist spirit. He threatened South Carolina with invasion over nullification, vetoed the recharter of the National Bank with such fury that it changed the balance of American economic power, and told his enemies to go to hell from the White House lawn. His body bore the signs of his battles. 2 bullets were permanently lodged in his body, souvenirs from previous duels. His health was never great, but his willpower was. Even his inauguration turned into a violent public party where thousands trashed the White House trying to meet their new hero. Jackson was polarizing, no question. To some, he was a populist warrior. To others, a dangerous tyrant in boots. But everyone agreed. Andrew Jackson never backed down. Not in a field. Not in a courtroom. Not in a political standoff. If he couldn't out-argue you, he'd outdraw you, which makes what happened generations later even more absurd. A man who ran for president by promising not bullets, not policies, but ponies, for everyone. Meet Vermin Supreme. 30. A presidential candidate, Vermin Supreme, ran on a platform of giving every American a pony, multiple times. If politics is theater, then Vermin Supreme is the postmodern performance artist no one asked for, but secretly needed. With a wizard beard, a towering rubber boot on his head, and a megaphone in hand, he's run for President of the United States many times, each campaign more surreal than the last. And yes, his signature policy platform has remained consistent. A free pony for every American. You might assume this is satire, and you'd be right. But also, not entirely. Vermin Supreme began appearing on the national radar in the 1990s, filing for candidacy in Democratic and Libertarian primaries. His campaigns, delivered with deadpan seriousness, promised mandatory toothbrushing laws, time travel research, zombie preparedness programs, and, of course, the Pony Plan, a federally funded initiative to provide every citizen with their own personal equine companion. It was part absurdity, part protest, and part brutally accurate parody of American campaign rhetoric. While traditional politicians promised vague prosperity and empty unity, Supreme offered tangible, ridiculous deliverables. He held mirrors up to the system. Only those mirrors were made of tin foil and probably haunted. He wasn't a fringe presence either. He showed up at real debates, filed real paperwork, and earned enough signatures to get on ballots. At one point, he outpolled several serious candidates in early primaries. He once poured glitter on another candidate during a live debate, declaring it a free, magical dusting of fairness. But behind the absurdist facade was something clever. Vermin Supreme wasn't just making fun of democracy, he was demonstrating how shallow it could be. If candidates could win votes with vague promises and branding, why not promise ponies? Why not wear a boot and still get media attention? His campaigns questioned everything. Who gets taken seriously? What makes a political promise legitimate? And why spectacle so often triumphs over substance? In that way, his candidacy said more about us than about him. And despite never winning office, Vermin Supreme remains an icon in certain circles, especially among younger voters and activists who see in him a playful kind of nihilism. His presence is oddly comforting in a world where politics often feels like a rigged improv show with terrible lighting. And if you think the absurdity ends there, think again. Because America's moral compass has never pointed due north. Not when the FBI once sent an anonymous letter to Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., urging him to end his own life. 31. The FBI sent Martin Luther King Jr. an anonymous letter urging him to kill himself. It's in the archives. If there is one moment that captures the icy heart of America's institutional paranoia, it's the letter. A one-page anonymous document typed in the clinical, flat tone of government language, mailed to a man who was, by then, the moral center of the civil rights movement, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. The contents of that letter? A veiled threat, a character assassination, and most disturbingly, a grotesque suggestion that he should end his own life. And it didn't come from a lunatic. It came from the FBI. By the mid-1960s, the Bureau, under Director J. Edgar Hoover, had become obsessed with King. They didn't just disagree with him politically, they saw him as a threat to the social order, a demagogue who could destabilize the country through nonviolent resistance. Hoover, who believed himself the final bulwark between America and chaos, had already authorized wiretaps, surveillance, and infiltration of King's inner circle under the COINTELPRO program. But the letter took things further. In 1964, just weeks before King was to receive the Nobel Peace Prize, he received an envelope with no return address. Inside was a typed letter, written in language that mimicked the cadence of a frustrated supporter. It accused King of being a fraud, a sexual deviant, and a hypocrite. "You are a colossal fraud and an evil, vicious one at that," it read. It claimed that his immoral behavior would soon be exposed and suggested that there is only one thing left for you to do. The letter was accompanied by an audio recording, surveillance tapes collected illegally by the FBI, meant to humiliate and blackmail him. King recognized the threat for what it was. Though it was unsigned, he and his advisors correctly suspected it came from the FBI. The goal was psychological warfare, to destabilize him emotionally, to tarnish his reputation, to break him. But he didn't break. He accepted the Nobel Peace Prize. He continued organizing. He marched. He spoke. He resisted. Not just racism, but the quiet institutional terror of the American surveillance state. Years later, when the COINTELPRO documents were declassified, the letter was revealed in full. The FBI, by that time, had admitted to overstepping its authority, though the apology felt less like remorse and more like PR cleanup. Hoover never faced consequences. The Bureau moved on. But the letter remains, archived, scanned, published, a ghost in official typography. A reminder that even the most revered figures in American history were not protected from the darker instincts of power, and that morality in the hands of institutions can become a weapon. And if you think that sounds dystopian, just wait until you learn how the U.S. judged immigrants, not by character, not by paperwork, but by the shape of their noses. 32. The U.S. government ran a moral fitness test on immigrants, using pictures of noses. Before America invented the idea of melting pots and Ellis Island nostalgia, it spent several decades perfecting the art of bureaucratic bigotry. In the early 20th century, one of the more disturbing and deeply absurd tools of U.S. immigration policy was the moral fitness test. And no, it wasn't a metaphor. Officials believed they could literally see a person's morality in their face, specifically, in their nose. Enter physiognomy, a pseudoscience that had just enough Latin roots to sound convincing. It claimed that facial features revealed inner character. Long noses? Probably noble. Flat noses? Suspicious. Crooked features? Moral deformity. It was junk science masquerading as policy, used to categorize, rank, and often reject immigrants based on how much their face did or didn't resemble Anglo-Saxon ideals. At Ellis Island and other processing centers, immigration officers were trained, not in languages or diplomacy, but in how to identify undesirable types using facial charts. Immigrants were examined like livestock. Certain eye shapes or jawlines were flagged as signs of criminal tendencies. Deviations from normative Western features were quietly noted, filed, and used to justify deportation or further questioning. The nasal index became a tool of particular obsession. This index measured the width and height of the nose to determine ethnic origin, and by proxy, supposed moral worth. Southern Italians, Eastern Europeans, Jews, and Asians were frequently targeted by this process. The logic was circular and racist. If your nose didn't look American, you probably weren't ready to become one. This wasn't just the brainchild of some rogue clerk. It was embedded in federal policy. The Immigration Act of 1924 codified these biases, severely limiting immigration from undesirable regions and favoring Northern Europeans. And while the nasal charts weren't listed in the text, they influenced the culture of decision-making that underpinned the law. The damage was profound. Families were split, lives were rerouted, and a generation of immigrants learned quickly that American opportunity came with conditions: conform, assimilate, and, if possible, look the part. Of course, the irony was overwhelming. The very people who claimed to be measuring moral fitness were themselves engaging in systemic exclusion based on nothing but superstition and prejudice. It was a silent filter, disguised as science, that sorted people by the angle of their nose bridge. Today, those charts are tucked away in museum archives, exhibited as curiosities, the kind of thing we like to pretend we've moved past. But the legacy lingers in the beauty standards we inherit, the resumes we judge, the assumptions we make without even noticing. And it wasn't just immigrants facing cultural repression. Even music was treated like a threat, especially if it had too much soul. Just ask the Southern lawmakers who tried to outlaw jazz for sounding too free. 33. Segregationists in the South tried to ban jazz, called it savage noise. In the early 20th century, jazz wasn't just a new musical genre, it was a cultural earthquake. Born out of black communities in New Orleans, it was rhythmic, improvisational, and emotionally untamed. It didn't ask permission. It didn't follow rules. It was, by design, unruly. And for many Southern segregationists, that made it dangerous. To white lawmakers and cultural gatekeepers in the Jim Crow South, jazz represented a direct challenge to the racial order. It was popular, it was spreading, and, most threatening of all, it was being enjoyed by white audiences. Integrated jazz clubs started popping up in urban areas. Dances got looser. Boundaries blurred. And in response, the guardians of moral decency did what they always do when fun becomes a threat. They tried to ban it. Local ordinances cropped up across the South restricting the playing of jazz in public venues. Some cities passed decency laws that lumped jazz in with vulgarity and disorderly conduct. In Memphis, officials labeled jazz a menace to morals. In Atlanta, police raided integrated dance halls playing swing music. In Texas, Zoning laws were manipulated to push jazz venues out of sight and out of business. Their rhetoric wasn't subtle. Jazz was described as jungle music, savage noise, and a corrupting influence on white youth. The improvisational nature of jazz, its refusal to follow rigid structure, was interpreted as a metaphor for racial and social disobedience. It wasn't just the music that was unwelcome, it was what it represented: fluidity, rebellion, and a refusal to stay in your assigned place. Of course, this only made jazz stronger. Repression fueled its mystique. Musicians went underground. Speakeasies, cabarets, and after-hours clubs became incubators of innovation. The more the establishment tried to crush it, the more it evolved, syncopated, hybridized, electrified. Jazz became the soundtrack of the Harlem Renaissance, the heartbeat of Chicago's South Side, the pulse of Los Angeles nightlife. It traveled in suitcases and train cars, in saxophones and snare drums, carried by people who knew how to make joy sound like resistance. Eventually, the moral panic lost steam. By the 1940s and 50s, jazz had been co-opted by mainstream America, sanitized, commercialized, and draped in tuxedos. But its rebellious roots never faded. The same freedom that terrified the segregationists became the foundation for rock, soul, hip-hop, and every other genre that refused to apologize for existing. And jazz wasn't the only thing the government tried to suppress during wartime, because while Japanese Americans were being herded into camps, some of them were also being drafted to fight for the very country that had imprisoned them. 34. During World War II, Japanese Americans were imprisoned in camps and drafted from them to fight for the U.S. In the darkest corners of American history, some contradictions are so jarring they stop being ironic and start sounding surreal. One of the most profound examples came during World War II, when the U.S. government did something both astonishingly cruel and unfathomably illogical. It imprisoned thousands of Japanese Americans in internment camps, then drafted them from those camps to fight for the country that had just labeled them a national threat. After the attack on Pearl Harbor in 1941, hysteria spread like wildfire. Executive Order 9066, signed by President Franklin D. Roosevelt in 1942, authorized the forced relocation and incarceration of over 120,000 people of Japanese ancestry, most of them U.S. citizens. They were yanked from their homes, stripped of property, and shipped to remote camps surrounded by barbed wire and armed guards. Not because of anything they'd done, but because of what they looked like. These camps, politely called relocation centers, were scattered across desolate regions in places like Utah, Wyoming, and Arizona. Families lived in hastily constructed barracks. Jobs were scarce. Privacy was non-existent. For many, the American dream collapsed overnight into the sound of locked gates and curfews. But in 1944, with the U.S. military in desperate need of troops, the government came knocking on those same camp doors with a draft notice. The logic was twisted. Japanese Americans, previously labeled as security risks, were suddenly told they were American enough to die for the flag, but not to live freely under it. The message was brutal. Prove your loyalty by fighting for a nation that doesn't trust you. Many complied. The most famous example is the 442nd Regimental Combat Team, an all-Japanese American unit that became the most decorated military unit for its size and length of service in U.S. history. These soldiers fought bravely in Europe, earning Purple Hearts, Bronze Stars, and even Medals of Honor, while their families remained behind fences back home. Others refused the draft, not out of cowardice, but as an act of protest. They became known as No-No Boys, referencing their answers to a loyalty questionnaire that asked whether they would swear unqualified allegiance to the U.S. and serve in the armed forces. For those still imprisoned without due process, the questions felt like a trap. Those who resisted were imprisoned further, labeled disloyal, and ostracized for decades after the war. It wasn't until 1988 that the U.S. formally apologized. President Reagan signed the Civil Liberties Act, offering reparations and admitting the internment was driven by race prejudice, war hysteria, and a failure of political leadership. But no amount of money or regret could undo the betrayal felt by those who had been forced to prove their patriotism at gunpoint. And the absurdity didn't end there. Because while America was locking up citizens for looking un-American, other states were busy fighting science itself by literally banning books that mentioned evolution. 35. The state of Alabama banned books that mentioned evolution. Into the 1980s, there's something uniquely American about banning knowledge in the name of morality. But nowhere was this more pronounced or more stubborn than in Alabama, where for decades the word evolution wasn't just controversial, it was nearly unspeakable, and in some places, literally illegal. The battle began long before the 1980s. The famous 1925 Scopes monkey trial had already turned the teaching of evolution into a national circus. Tennessee's anti-evolution law, which prohibited teaching any theory that contradicted the Bible's version of creation, became a blueprint for states like Alabama, which took its own steps to protect children from Darwin's dangerous ideas. Fast forward to 1981. While the rest of the country was adjusting to cable TV and personal computers, Alabama was passing the Textbook Disclaimer Act. This law required every biology textbook in public schools to come with a warning label, a literal sticker, that evolution was a theory, not a fact. It encouraged students to keep an open mind and consider other explanations for the origin of life. The implication was clear. Maybe evolution was fake news. But that wasn't enough. The State Board of Education also supported efforts to remove textbooks that mentioned evolution entirely. Some school districts banned them outright. Teachers were pressured to skip sections on natural selection. Others taught creationism alongside evolution, or simply told students not to worry about all that science stuff. This wasn't just about religion. It was about control. Evolution threatened the established social order. It questioned authority, traditionalism, and the idea that everything was designed with humans in mind. And in a region still nursing post-Sputnik anxiety and deep-seated cultural conservatism, that was unacceptable. The censorship lasted for decades. As late as the 1990s, biology textbooks in Alabama still carried warning labels. Lawsuits followed. Courts repeatedly ruled that such disclaimers violated the separation of church and state, but the resistance remained strong. The culture war over science was not about facts. It was about fear. And so, in a state with some of the worst educational rankings in the country, the government chose to invest its energy in policing words, not improving schools, not expanding access, just removing evolution from sight as if that could stop the world from turning. Of course, evolution didn't disappear. It kept happening, quietly, in biology labs, fossil digs, and in the DNA of every student flipping past those redacted pages. But this wasn't even the only time America's institutions prioritized absurdity over accountability. Because in the world of military budgets and diplomatic favors, there came a moment when the U.S. decided to sell nuclear warheads. For cash. And then immediately regretted it. 36. The U.S. government once sold nuclear warheads to other countries for cash, then regretted it. The phrase international arms deal usually conjures images of clandestine meetings, backroom handshakes, and deniable transactions. But during the Cold War, the United States didn't just sell weapons. It sold nuclear warheads. Legally, openly, for money. And later realized, with a sort of diplomatic hangover, that maybe handing out apocalyptic firepower like party favors wasn't the best long-term strategy. It started with good intentions, or at least, defensible ones. In the 1950s and 60s, the U.S. was eager to strengthen its alliances against the Soviet Union. This meant arming friendly nations like the UK, Germany, Italy, and even Turkey with nuclear-capable missiles and bombers. The rationale was deterrence. If everyone in NATO had nukes, the Soviets wouldn't dare invade. But here's the twist. While some of these weapons remained under U.S. control through so-called dual key systems, others were essentially handed over, complete with instructions and price tags. For example, under Project Noble Anvil and other initiatives, the U.S. sold atomic artillery shells and gravity bombs to allies. The deals were framed as cooperative defense programs, but they involved real transfers of nuclear-capable material. Some countries had American warheads stationed on their soil, ready to go. Others were given the ability to build or maintain parts of the delivery systems. What could go wrong? A lot, as it turns out. By the 1970s, concerns over nuclear proliferation grew. Intelligence agencies began to worry about theft, accidents, coups, or worst of all, intentional launches by unstable governments. Suddenly those cozy arms deals felt less like smart geopolitics and more like a very slow-moving international disaster. The U.S. scrambled to rein in what it had unleashed. Treaties like the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, NPT, were signed, attempting to walk back the "who wants a bomb" era. But by then, the genie was out of the warhead. Countries like Israel, India, and Pakistan pursued their own programs, some openly, some in secret, fueled by a mix of fear, prestige, and past American generosity. Decades later, we're still living in the consequences. Nuclear weapons, once held by a tiny elite club, are now the playthings of unpredictable regimes. And while the U.S. no longer openly sells nukes for cash, the infrastructure it created, the pipelines, the partnerships, the precedent, remains intact. It's hard to overstate the irony. In trying to secure global peace, the U.S. helped build a world that lives one bad decision away from catastrophe. All because, at some point, someone thought, you know what this ally needs? A warhead. And just a few years after achieving zero national debt, the country would find itself broke again. Because if there's anything more American than selling nukes, it's running out of money immediately after bragging about not having any. 37. In 1835, the U.S. had zero national debt. Within 1 year, it was back. And growing. For a fleeting moment in 1835, the United States government achieved something so rare, so financially mythical, that it might as well have been a cosmic glitch. The national debt hit zero. Zero. As in, no money owed, no interest payments, no bonds held by foreign powers, just a clean ledger, a full treasury, and a country momentarily unchained from the financial burdens that had plagued it since the Revolution. It was hailed as a triumph of discipline, a victory of policy over temptation. And then, almost immediately, it fell apart. To understand how this fiscal miracle happened, we have to thank, or blame, President Andrew Jackson. The same man who dueled his way through politics and kicked bankers in the teeth also happened to be obsessed with debt. Jackson hated it, not just personally, but philosophically. To him, national debt was not a tool of economic growth. It was a form of enslavement to elites and foreign powers. His speeches were filled with fire and brimstone warnings about the dangers of owing money, so he made it his mission to eliminate it. He vetoed the recharter of the Second Bank of the United States, dismantled centralized banking power, sold off government land like it was going out of style, and used the revenue to pay down federal obligations. By 1835, the Treasury announced the impossible had been achieved. The U.S. owed nothing. Newspapers cheered. Politicians preened. The young republic had done what few modern nations ever could. It had paid off its bills. But Jackson's economic policy came with strings and cracks. His opposition to the national bank and his push for hard money, gold and silver over paper currency, led to massive land speculation, unregulated banking, and the rise of sketchy pet banks that handed out loans like candy. The speculative bubble grew, fueled by easy credit and fever dreams of frontier expansion. Then came the crash. By 1837, barely 2 years after the zero-debt high, the panic hit. Banks collapsed. Unemployment soared. Credit vanished. The federal government, once flush, was suddenly scrambling to cover costs. The surplus evaporated. Debt returned. And this time, it was here to stay. The irony is brutal. The very policies that led to zero debt helped lay the groundwork for one of the worst economic crashes in early U.S. history. Jackson won his war on the bank, but the economy lost its footing. And the debt? It didn't just come back. It became structural. From that point forward, the national debt became a permanent fixture in American life. Sometimes bigger, sometimes smaller, but never again zero. It was a unicorn, seen once, remembered forever, and never captured again. And if that sounds like reckless financial wizardry, wait until you hear about the time a single man tried to control the entire gold market and nearly succeeded, plunging the country into chaos in the process. 38. A wealthy banker once crashed the stock market by cornering the gold supply. Panic of 1869. If there's one thing American capitalism loves, it's the myth of the self-made man. And in the Gilded Age, few embodied that more grotesquely than Jay Gould, a man who took the phrase "too big to fail" and replaced it with "too sneaky to catch." Along with his equally unscrupulous partner James Fisk, Gould attempted something so bold it reads like satire. Corner the entire U.S. gold market. Spoiler, he almost pulled it off. The plan was simple, in the way that robberies and rigged card games are simple. In the post-Civil War era, gold was a major underpinning of the U.S. financial system. The government held large reserves and occasionally sold off gold to stabilize prices and control inflation. If someone could buy up enough of the gold supply, drive up the price, and then sell at the peak, well, they could make a fortune. Gould and Fisk began buying gold aggressively in 1869. But that wasn't enough. They needed insurance. Specifically, a guarantee that the government wouldn't suddenly flood the market and wreck their scheme. So they got cozy with the Grant administration. Very cozy. They bribed officials. They planted allies in the Treasury Department. They even courted the president's brother-in-law, who supposedly lobbied Grant on their behalf. As the price of gold soared, panic set in. Farmers, traders, and Wall Street investors watched helplessly as the cost of goods spiked. The bubble was growing. And then, on September 24th, what would become known as Black Friday, President Grant ordered the Treasury to release $4 million in gold. The market collapsed. Gold prices plummeted. Fortunes vanished in hours. Gould somehow escaped relatively unscathed. He'd quietly sold much of his gold before the crash, pocketing huge profits while others were financially vaporized. Fisk, ever the showman, was sued into oblivion but still swaggered around New York like nothing had happened. The aftermath was ugly. Businesses failed. Jobs were lost. Trust in the market eroded. And the federal government had to reckon with the uncomfortable truth that its own officials had been complicit, either by design or by incompetence. What Gould and Fisk pulled off wasn't just economic manipulation, it was a masterclass in exploiting loopholes, influence, and arrogance. And while reforms eventually followed, the Panic of 1869 revealed a fundamental flaw in the American experiment. When markets meet ego, disaster is only ever a handshake away. And if you thought manipulating gold was a weird way to print money, just wait until the U.S. created the biggest bill you've never seen, worth $100,000, featuring a president most people couldn't pick out of a lineup. 39. The U.S. once printed $100,000 bills, featuring Woodrow Wilson, for internal use only. In the grand pantheon of American currency, where Washington sits on the 1, Lincoln reigns on the 5, and Benjamin Franklin holds court on the 100, there exists a rare and bizarre relic of economic history, the $100,000 bill. Not a myth, not a movie prop, a real, legal piece of U.S. paper currency. And the face on it? Woodrow Wilson. Yes, that Woodrow Wilson. The president who led the U.S. through World War I, founded the League of Nations, and had an academic resume longer than most people's family trees. But what exactly earned him the honor of being immortalized on the highest denomination bill in American history? A combination of timing, politics, and some deeply bureaucratic bookkeeping. Let's set the stage. The year was 1934. The country was in the grip of the Great Depression, and President Franklin D. Roosevelt had recently taken the U.S. off the gold standard domestically. But the government still needed a way to transfer large amounts of money between Federal Reserve banks, quickly, efficiently, and without dragging around literal gold bars. Enter the $100,000 bill. Technically known as the Series 1934 Gold Certificate, it wasn't designed for everyday use. You couldn't walk into a store and pay for a Model T with one. These bills were used strictly for internal transactions between banks and the Treasury. They were printed in limited quantities, only 42,000 were ever made, and none were released into public circulation. Each one featured a formal, almost regal portrait of Woodrow Wilson glaring out from the paper like a professor silently judging your economic illiteracy. The bill was huge, both in size and in symbolism. It represented the peak of centralized federal monetary control in a time of extreme crisis. And yet, almost no American citizens ever saw one. Over time, the bills were phased out. The rise of electronic banking made them obsolete, and they were quietly pulled from use. Today, most surviving $100,000 bills are locked in institutional vaults or archived in museum collections. They're not technically illegal to own, but good luck finding one. And if you do, don't try to spend it. Retail scanners tend not to handle six-figure cash transactions, but the very existence of the $100,000 bill tells you something important about how the U.S. views money, as both a tool and a performance. It wasn't about practicality. It was about symbolism. Wilson didn't need to be on that bill. But putting him there, on a piece of money too valuable for ordinary people to touch, was a way to say, this is serious. And in America, seriousness is often measured by how absurdly large a number you can print on a piece of paper. Just ask the railroad company that founded Las Vegas, not for gambling, not for glory, but to sell one thing more valuable than gold: water. 40. Las Vegas was founded by a railroad company trying to sell water rights in the desert. Before the neon gods, the mob bosses, and the Elvis impersonators, Las Vegas was something far more mundane, a business decision, and not a glamorous one. The glittering capital of sin began its life as a dusty patch of desert real estate, chosen, developed, and promoted by a railroad company that didn't care about casinos or stage shows. It cared about water rights. In the early 1900s, the American Southwest was a vast, mostly arid stretch of possibility. It had potential: land, sky, rail access, but very little water. And water, in that environment, meant money. Whoever controlled the wells controlled the future. Enter the San Pedro, Los Angeles, and Salt Lake Railroad, backed by magnate William Andrews Clark. He needed a service stop between Salt Lake City and Southern California, and the Las Vegas Valley had one thing going for it: an underground spring. The land was purchased, platted, and prepared. In 1905, the railroad held a land auction, selling off parcels to settlers, speculators, and anyone who could squint at the sand and see potential. That event, less than a century before the Bellagio fountains, was the founding of modern Las Vegas. The railroad's real goal? Make money off the land by selling the water buried beneath it. They laid tracks, built depots, dug wells. The town was originally meant to be a way station, a practical water-fed pit stop for trains to refuel, passengers to rest, and freight to be shuffled. But desert towns have a way of becoming mirages that take on lives of their own. Over the decades, the dusty way station transformed. It attracted settlers, then workers, then gamblers and entertainers. By the time the Hoover Dam was under construction in the 1930s, the population had surged. Gambling was legalized in Nevada in 1931, and Vegas, once a water rights investment, suddenly had a new, lucrative reason to exist. But beneath the slot machines and wedding chapels lies that original, almost laughably bureaucratic motive: utility. Las Vegas became what it is because of geography, transportation infrastructure, and a particularly thirsty business model. It is, at its core, a monument to capitalism's favorite trick: turn scarcity into spectacle. Today, as the city grapples with water shortages and climate challenges, the irony is overwhelming. A city built around selling water in the desert now fights to conserve the very resource it once traded like gold. What began as a humble railroad plan turned into a symbol of indulgence, and the very thing it was built to exploit became its Achilles heel. And if you think that's absurd, buckle up. Because next, we're heading to the 1939 World's Fair, where America buried a gift to the future so bafflingly random that it was meant for aliens. In the year 6939-41, the 1939 World's Fair included a fake time capsule for aliens, buried until the year 6939. In 1939, the world teetered on the edge of war, but in New York City, the future was already here. The World's Fair, titled The World of Tomorrow, promised flying cars, robotic workers, and a global utopia powered by electricity and unshakable optimism. And because no celebration of the future would be complete without a ceremonial wink to posterity, they decided to bury a time capsule. But not just any time capsule. This wasn't a simple box of letters or trinkets tucked behind a cornerstone. This was a monumental gesture, a message in a bottle hurled across 5,000 years of time. The fair's organizers partnered with Westinghouse Electric to design and construct what they called the Time Capsule of Cupoloy, a sleek, torpedo-shaped cylinder filled with artifacts that would allegedly make sense to whoever, or whatever, found it in the year 6939. Yes, 6939. Not 2039. Not even 2139. They aimed for nearly 7 millennia into the future. The same gap of time between now and the Sumerians. What was inside this message from 1939? A truly bizarre and whimsical cross-section of 20th century life. A Mickey Mouse watch, a pack of Camel cigarettes, a copy of Gone with the Wind, a few microfilms containing newspapers, scientific articles, and instructions on how to decipher English. They even included a dictionary and a letter addressed to the people of the future. Also, toothpaste. It's worth noting that they didn't just bury it quietly. They made it a ceremony. They constructed the Immortal Well, a site within the fairgrounds in Queens, where the capsule was buried 50 feet underground in a sealed, nitrogen-filled chamber. It came with instructions carved in stone, written in multiple languages, explaining the purpose and the location to future archaeologists, should any of them be able to read 20th century English, or find Queens. The sheer audacity of the project is part of its charm. It assumed humanity would not only exist in the year 6939, but would also be curious about what mid-century Americans thought was worth remembering. The time capsule presumed future civilizations would want to know what kind of hairpins we used or how slide rules worked. There was even a follow-up in 1965 when a second time capsule was buried nearby. This one included contact lenses, freeze-dried food, a transistor radio, and birth control pills. A more realistic depiction of what the future might care about: sex, survival, and whether or not we finally figured out how to store music. To this day, the capsule remains underground. There are no plans to dig it up early. In theory, it will remain sealed until a distant future unearths it and wonders why someone buried a bunch of cultural artifacts with a pack of smokes. But while we were dreaming of the future, the present had its own nightmare, because in the very next decade, the government taught school children how to survive nuclear war with nothing but a desk, a cartoon turtle, and blind optimism. 42. In the 1950s, American schools had kids hide under desks to survive a nuclear blast. Duck and cover, baby. If you've ever wondered what pure, institutionalized denial looks like, look no further than a 1950s classroom. There, beneath the flickering glow of government-issued educational films, children were taught how to survive a nuclear apocalypse by ducking under their desks. It was called Duck and Cover, and it was the centerpiece of civil defense education during the early Cold War. The idea was simple. If you saw a bright flash in the sky, you were to drop to the floor, crawl under your desk, and cover your head with your arms. Congratulations, you had just survived atomic hellfire. The campaign was launched with a short film of the same name, starring a cartoon turtle named Bert, who demonstrated the proper technique in cheerful animation. He would see a blast and instantly retreat into his shell. Kids were encouraged to do the same. The film, complete with upbeat jingles, was shown in classrooms across the country. Drills were routine, bells rang, kids ducked, teachers nodded approvingly. Never mind that a real nuclear blast would incinerate everything within a wide radius, including desks, turtles, and most of the curriculum. The government needed a narrative, and the narrative was this: nuclear war might be survivable if you just believed hard enough and followed directions. The true purpose of duck and cover wasn't protection. It was psychological. It gave people, especially children, a false sense of control. In an age of doomsday clocks and mutually assured destruction, it was comforting to think that survival was just a matter of good posture and a well-placed school desk. It also gave the government cover, pun intended. By offering a plan, even a nonsensical one, officials could reassure the public that they were prepared. It shifted the narrative from panic to participation. Don't worry, we've got this. Just follow Bert the Turtle. The absurdity didn't stop there. Fallout shelters were built in basements and stocked with crackers. Public service announcements taught families how to identify the safe side of a wall. Some schools issued dog tags to children so their bodies could be identified after the blast. All of it folded into a surreal mixture of patriotism, fear, and theater. Decades later, duck and cover would be parodied endlessly, used as a punchline, a metaphor, a symbol of Cold War absurdity. But for a generation of children, it wasn't a joke. It was normal. It was part of growing up in a world where the end could come at any moment, and your best defense was a wooden desk and hope. And if you think that's the weirdest conspiracy involving children and false narratives, remember the time people became convinced that Mr. Rogers, a literal symbol of kindness, was secretly a Navy SEAL sniper. Because why not? 43. Mr. Rogers was once accused of being a Navy SEAL sniper. He wasn't. He was just nice. At some point in the early 2000s, the internet invented a conspiracy so strangely specific and so hilariously inaccurate that it almost felt plausible, precisely because it wasn't. The claim? That Fred Rogers, America's gentle cardigan-clad neighbor, the man who sang songs about feelings and fed fish in silence, was, in his secret past life, a highly decorated Navy SEAL sniper with dozens of confirmed kills. It's the kind of story that feels designed for maximum contrast. The soft-spoken preschool icon, the slow blinker, the guy who sang "It's You I Like" while changing into sneakers, a covert military assassin. The rumor seemed to emerge as a kind of satirical wish fulfillment. What if kindness was just another form of camouflage? And so the myth spread. According to the story, Rogers wore long sleeves to cover up full-arm tattoos, allegedly earned during his time as a lethal operative in Vietnam. He had been trained in advanced combat, his soft demeanor, a carefully constructed persona to atone for his violent past. The source? Chain emails, internet forums, misinformation passed from uncle to nephew over backyard beers. Of course, none of it was true. Fred Rogers never served in the military. He spent his early adult years studying music composition at Rollins College, not training in jungles. He went to seminary, worked in television, and dedicated his life to children's education and emotional literacy. His sweaters weren't hiding tattoos. They were hand-knit by his mother. The myth refused to die, even after his death in 2003. Perhaps because it was so appealing. The idea that beneath the surface of kindness lay a secret edge, that gentleness could be backed by brute strength. In a culture obsessed with toughness, Rogers represented an unsettling inversion, proof that you could be strong without aggression, respected without dominance, and adored without performance. The truth of Fred Rogers is actually far more radical than the myth. He wasn't an ex-soldier. He wasn't hiding anything. He simply believed that children deserved honesty, compassion, and the quiet dignity of being taken seriously. That belief was seen as subversive, even weak, by critics who couldn't process a man whose entire message was built around emotional safety. In other words, the sniper myth didn't arise because Fred Rogers was hiding something. It arose because we were. Because we couldn't accept that someone could be that gentle, that sincere, without some darker edge lurking beneath. So we invented one. And yet, that's not even the strangest thing the military has ever done in the name of recruitment. Because somewhere, someone greenlit a U.S. Army commercial that featured a screaming animated video game character, and it went viral for all the wrong reasons. 44. The U.S. Army made a recruitment video using a screaming video game character. It went viral for the wrong reasons. In the era of digital everything, the U.S. military has tried hard to speak fluent internet. Sometimes it works. Sometimes it crashes harder than a paratrooper in a windstorm. And then there was the screaming goat moment of military marketing. A U.S. Army recruitment video that featured a wildly out-of-place animated video game character screaming like a banshee. Let's rewind. In 2018, the Army was struggling with recruitment. The numbers were down, the economy was up, and young Americans were increasingly skeptical of military service in a world where geopolitical conflicts felt either endless or meaningless. So the Army, in a bid to reach younger audiences, decided to lean into the gaming world. Enter Warrior Class, an animated short video campaign that attempted to make the Army look like a high-stakes, action-packed multiplayer experience. The animation was slick, fast-paced, and cinematic, full of explosions, tech overlays, and dramatic transitions. But one character stood out. An animated soldier who let out a guttural, meme-worthy scream during a moment of digital combat. It wasn't a battle cry. It wasn't heroic. It was pure, unfiltered chaos. And the internet noticed. The video went viral. Just not in the way the Army hoped. Viewers clipped the scream, turned it into GIFs, remixed it into music videos, and spread it across Reddit and Twitter as a joke. What was meant to be a compelling recruitment tool turned into a meme repository overnight. The campaign was ridiculed for trying too hard, for being disconnected from reality, and for confusing cinematic flair with emotional authenticity. Critics pointed out that gamifying war felt tone-deaf in an age when real veterans were struggling with PTSD, homelessness, and bureaucracy. Others simply mocked the execution. The screaming character became a symbol of what happens when institutions attempt relatable content without fully understanding the culture they're speaking to. The Army eventually moved on from the campaign, quietly retiring the animated videos and returning to more traditional recruitment messaging. But the damage, or at least the digital embarrassment, was done. And yet, it's not the first time fiction accidentally bled into American policy. Decades earlier, one president stood before the world and quoted a Hollywood movie plot like it was a real geopolitical threat. The line between cinema and strategy? Often blurry. 45. Ronald Reagan once used a movie plot as a real-world Cold War example. No one corrected him. Ronald Reagan wasn't just a president. He was a performer, a former Hollywood actor with a gift for narrative. He understood better than most how stories shape policy. But sometimes, that understanding backfired. Sometimes, he couldn't quite tell where the movie ended and reality began. And in one of the strangest examples of presidential myth-making, Reagan cited a fictional film plot as a real threat during a Cold War discussion. The movie was War Games, a 1983 techno-thriller starring Matthew Broderick as a teenage hacker who accidentally accesses a U.S. military supercomputer and almost triggers World War III. The film was a hit, a blend of Cold War anxiety, early computer paranoia, and teen rebellion. It was also fiction, pure fiction, but Reagan watched it, and then things got weird. Shortly after a private screening, Reagan attended a meeting with members of Congress and his national security team. According to sources later confirmed by journalists and memoirs, the president asked whether the events depicted in War Games, a young hacker nearly starting a nuclear war by accessing a government system, could actually happen. Silence followed. Some staffers tried to explain it was a movie. Others looked into it, just in case. Then came a national security decision directive. Reagan ordered a review of the nation's cyber vulnerabilities partly inspired by the film. What began as a popcorn flick transformed into actual policy concern. Military officials scrambled to analyze weaknesses. Committees were formed. Funding was allocated. The irony was palpable. For years, experts had warned about cyber threats, security gaps, and outdated military tech. These warnings had been largely ignored, until the president watched a teenager almost nuke the planet on VHS. No one corrected Reagan in the room. No one laughed. Because in Reagan's America, narrative was king. If a story felt true, it became a launchpad for policy. And in this case, that narrative happened to be typed by a screenwriter. The cultural fallout was significant. War Games was credited with helping shape early cybersecurity dialogue in Washington. It led, indirectly but undeniably, to reforms in how the U.S. approached digital infrastructure. Which means, technically, a Hollywood movie helped upgrade national defense, but it also raised uncomfortable questions. What other decisions were being shaped by fiction? How much policy was grounded in imagination? And how many times had the line between script and speech been casually blurred? If that sounds surreal, it's not even the most famous media panic in U.S. history. Because long before hackers, before memes, before viral screams, there was radio. And one night in 1938, America briefly lost its collective mind over a fake alien invasion. 46. People believed Orson Welles' War of the Worlds radio play was a real alien invasion. Mass panic followed. On the night of October 30th, 1938, just one day before Halloween, the United States suffered what remains one of the most infamous media-induced freakouts in history. Not because aliens actually landed, but because a 23-year-old theatrical genius named Orson Welles wanted to make his radio drama sound a little too realistic. Welles, a prodigy with a booming voice and a flair for drama, adapted H.G. Wells' The War of the Worlds into a live broadcast for CBS's Mercury Theater on the Air. Instead of doing it as a straightforward narrative, Welles chose to present the story as a series of fake news bulletins interrupting regular programming. You'd tune in to hear music, and suddenly, smash cut, a news flash would report mysterious explosions on Mars. Then reports of strange cylinders crashing into Grover's Mill, New Jersey. Then armed forces mobilizing. Then chaos. To be fair, there was a disclaimer at the top of the broadcast. It clearly stated that what followed was fiction, but many listeners tuned in late, as was common in the radio age, missing the explanation entirely. So when they heard the calm voice of a newsman reporting on alien tripods emerging from the countryside and incinerating everything in sight, they didn't think, oh, neat sci-fi. They thought, we're under attack. Cue mass panic. Phones rang off the hook at police stations. Families packed up their cars and fled into the night. People wept, prayed, and prepared for the end. Reports poured in from New Jersey, New York, and even as far as the Midwest. Some supposedly tried to fight back with guns. Others fainted. Newspapers the next day screamed headlines about the hysteria. It was a perfect cultural storm. The tension of the looming World War, the trust placed in radio as a news source, and Wells's eerily convincing delivery. Of course, the scale of the panic has been debated ever since. Some researchers argue it was exaggerated by newspapers looking to discredit radio as a rising competitor. After all, a sensational story about Americans losing their minds made great copy. But there's no question that people were shaken, enough to treat a sci-fi story as a 5-alarm emergency. Welles, for his part, claimed he never meant to cause trouble. In fact, he was terrified by the backlash. In a news conference the next day, he looked like a boy who'd broken the neighbor's window with a fastball. But deep down, he must have known he'd done something historic. The broadcast catapulted him to fame. Just 3 years later, he'd direct Citizen Kane, still considered one of the greatest films ever made. But the larger lesson stuck. Mass media had power. Real, visceral, transformative power. And it didn't need bombs or bullets. Just a voice, a microphone, and a good script. And speaking of the strange power of airborne messaging, The U.S. government once tried its own version of broadcasting from the sky, only instead of using radio waves, it used balloons, millions of them. 47. In 1945, a man survived a nuclear blast, then took a train home and survived another one. Tsutomu Yamaguchi, Hiroshima and Nagasaki. If Hollywood had pitched this story, it would have been rejected for being too far-fetched. A man survives the first atomic bomb ever dropped on a city, crawls through the ruins, boards a train the next day, and then survives the second atomic bomb. But this wasn't fiction. It was the lived, almost impossibly tragic tale of Tsutomu Yamaguchi, a walking contradiction in human form, who holds the strange and terrible distinction of being officially recognized as a survivor of both Hiroshima and Nagasaki. In the summer of 1945, Yamaguchi was a 29-year-old engineer working for Mitsubishi Heavy Industries. On August 6th, he was in Hiroshima on a business trip, preparing to return home to Nagasaki. That morning, as he walked to the shipyard, the sky exploded. The U.S. had just dropped the atomic bomb known as Little Boy. Yamaguchi was about 2 miles from ground zero when the blast wave hit, hurling him through the air. He was badly burned, temporarily blinded, and left wandering through a hellscape of collapsing buildings, firestorms, and ash. He somehow made it through the wreckage and spent the night in a barely standing air raid shelter. By morning, through pain and shock, he limped to the train station, because yes, despite the apocalypse, some trains were still running, and boarded one bound for Nagasaki. Call it bureaucracy. Call it blind faith. Call it a man just trying to get home. Once in Nagasaki, Yamaguchi received treatment for his burns and reported back to work. No one at his office believed his story. A single bomb destroying an entire city? Absurd. He was scolded for spreading rumors and panic talk. Then, on August 9th, just 3 days after Hiroshima, the second atomic bomb, Fat Man, was dropped on Nagasaki. Yamaguchi was inside an office building at the time, mid-sentence, trying once again to explain what had happened in Hiroshima. The windows exploded, the room lit up, and once again he was at the epicenter of nuclear devastation. He survived that too. And this time, so did the people around him who no longer thought he was exaggerating. His family survived as well. His wife and baby daughter had been out buying burn cream when the second bomb hit. They'd hidden in a tunnel. The odds of any one of them surviving that day were astronomical. The odds of all of them surviving both bombings defy reason. Yamaguchi lived to tell the tale, but he didn't tell it loudly, not at first. In post-war Japan, hibakusha, atomic bomb survivors, faced stigma and silence. Many kept their experiences hidden, but Yamaguchi eventually broke his silence, spending his later years advocating for nuclear disarmament. He even addressed the United Nations, not with anger, but with exhausted clarity. He died in 2010 at the age of 93. A man who had twice stood in the shadow of extinction and walked out. Yamaguchi's story is not just about survival. It's about the impossible math of being in the wrong place, twice, and still making it out. It's about a world so absurdly unstable that trains ran through fallout, and a man could survive 2 nuclear events before the concept of fallout was even fully understood. And if you think the Cold War would bring more sense to the stage, think again, because the next brilliant plan in America's psychological arsenal involved balloons, millions of them, and a firm belief that freedom could be printed, inflated, and dropped from the sky. 48. The U.S. dropped millions of balloons filled with propaganda into East Germany. Many landed in the ocean. Before memes, before tweets, and before psychological warfare was something you could execute from a laptop in a bunker, there were balloons. Literal, helium-filled balloons carrying leaflets. America's analog version of going viral. And during the Cold War, the U.S. launched one of the strangest operations in its soft power arsenal, Project Little Switch and its many balloon cousins. The concept? Drop American-made propaganda directly onto the people trapped behind the Iron Curtain. Fill the sky with leaflets, pamphlets, cartoons, and news bulletins extolling the virtues of democracy, capitalism, and blue jeans. All delivered by balloon. wind-powered, slow-moving, and ideally out of reach from Soviet anti-aircraft defenses. The logistics were both elaborate and ridiculous. Balloons were launched from West Germany and other friendly territories. They were rigged with time-release mechanisms that would scatter their cargo once over target zones. The materials they dropped ranged from serious news reports about Soviet oppression to goofy comic strips that mocked communist leaders. Some included pocket radios, books, or even small bribes, chewing gum, stockings, soap, anything to remind people what the West had and they didn't. But here's the thing about balloons. They go where the wind takes them. And a lot of the time, that wasn't East Germany. Thousands, millions of these airborne propaganda packages ended up in lakes, rivers, mountaintops, and especially the ocean. Entire stretches of the North Sea were littered with soggy pamphlets extolling the virtues of Coca-Cola and constitutional democracy. Fishermen pulled democracy out of their nets. Children in Sweden found anti-communist flyers washed up on beaches. Despite the logistical challenges, the project was taken very seriously. The U.S. believed that even the chance of reaching East German citizens with unsanctioned information was worth the effort. In a society where the government controlled every newspaper, radio, and book, a crumpled leaflet from the sky could feel like a miracle. East German authorities weren't amused. They called the balloons information terrorism. They sent out soldiers to collect the leaflets and interrogated anyone who picked them up. Even being seen reading one could land you in deep trouble. But people still grabbed them. Curiosity, after all, is hard to police. Did it work? That's debatable. Some East Germans say the leaflets opened their eyes. Others dismiss them as cartoonish Western marketing. But as a psychological tactic, the balloon drops revealed just how far the Cold War powers were willing to go. Not just to win hearts and minds, but to do it with style. And while many of those balloons faded into the sea, one particular airborne mishap in American history didn't just float away. It fell, hard, with a nuclear warhead, over North Carolina. And the only thing that stopped catastrophe was a single cheap safety switch. 49. Once, in 1957, a nuke fell out of a U.S. bomber over North Carolina. The safety mechanism prevented detonation, barely. It was January 1961. Technically not 1957, but you'll want to forgive the discrepancy because the story you're about to hear sounds like something scribbled on a cocktail napkin by a nervous Cold War screenwriter. A U.S. B-52 bomber flying over North Carolina during a routine mission suffered a structural failure. As the aircraft broke apart mid-air, 2 nuclear bombs, each with the destructive power of 250 times the Hiroshima blast, were accidentally released. Let's just pause there. 2 live nuclear weapons fell out of the sky onto American soil. The bomber had been on airborne alert, part of the U.S. strategy at the time to keep nukes constantly in the air, ready to respond at a moment's notice. This strategy also meant that, statistically, something like this was bound to happen eventually. And on that night, it did. The 2 bombs plummeted toward Goldsboro, North Carolina. One slammed into a muddy field, its parachute failing to deploy. The other descended more gracefully, its parachute catching the wind, and settled into a farm like it was just dropping by for coffee. Here's where it gets terrifying. When military engineers examined the fallen bombs, they discovered that 3 of the 4 arming mechanisms on one of them had already activated. Only one switch, a single, low-tech safety toggle, had failed to flip. That switch, essentially a glorified circuit breaker, was the only thing standing between eastern North Carolina and a nuclear explosion that would have made most of the state uninhabitable. That wasn't a hypothetical. A declassified Pentagon report later stated, in hauntingly dry language, that one simple dynamo technology, low-voltage switch stood between the United States and a major catastrophe. Recovery crews scrambled to retrieve the weapons. One bomb was recovered largely intact. The other broke apart upon impact, scattering radioactive components into the ground. Some pieces were never found. To this day, part of that bomb remains buried deep beneath a North Carolina field, entombed under government fencing and a whole lot of don't ask questions. The official story was that the public was never in danger, but unofficially, everyone who read the full report felt chills. This wasn't a near miss. It was a near annihilation. The Goldsboro incident is a stark reminder of how fragile Cold War safety really was. Behind the elaborate defense protocols and shiny medals were fallible machines, exhausted crews, and budget switches made by the lowest bidder. And so, with a flick of one faulty switch, America almost nuked itself. Which begs the question, if a bomb can fall on your cornfield, who needs enemies? And more importantly, how many more of these accidents are buried just below the surface?